30, not 3, not 7, not 10. 30 separate lessons, 30 distinct doorways, 30 different angles on a single word that most people have quietly learned to dread. And there is a reason the number is 30, a reason it is not 5 and not 100. A reason we are going to walk slowly through 30 of these and not stop sooner. Because obedience to God is not one lesson. It is not a single command you master once and then file away and forget. It is a whole architecture. It is a full house with 30 rooms, and most of us have only ever stood in the doorway of 2 or 3 of them, peering in, assuming we already know what the rest of the house contains. We assume obedience is small. We assume it is grim. We assume it is the joyless part of faith, the part you grit your teeth and endure so that you can get to the parts you actually enjoy, the comfort, the belonging, the promises. And across the next hours together, across these 30 lessons, I want to dismantle that assumption completely, brick by brick, room by room, until you finally see what obedience to God actually is and actually does. Not to God, who needs nothing whatsoever from you, but to you in the deepest and most hidden places where you actually live your life. Because here is the thing that almost no one tells you, the thing that gets buried under centuries of religious noise and human misunderstanding. Obedience is not the price of God's love. It is the pathway into the experience of it. It is not the toll you pay at the gate to be allowed into the kingdom. It is the road that runs straight through the middle of the kingdom, the road you walk once you are already inside. And the reason there are 30 lessons and not one is that the transformation obedience works in a human soul is so total, so layered, so patient and unhurried in its unfolding, that you could spend an entire lifetime discovering what a single act of yes to God sets quietly in motion, and still find, standing at the very end of that long life, that you had only just begun to understand it. The number 30 carries its own quiet weight all through the scripture, and it is worth pausing on before we begin, because it is not an accident that we are gathering exactly this many lessons. Jesus was 30 years old when he stepped out of obscurity and into his public ministry. 30 years of hidden, silent, unremarkable obedience in a carpenter's shop in the small and forgotten town of Nazareth, before a single miracle, before a single sermon, before a single word that the world would ever remember. 30 years of doing ordinary work faithfully. 30 years of sweeping sawdust from a floor, of honoring an earthly mother and a guardian father, of showing up week after week to the same synagogue, of learning a trade with his hands, of living a life that from the outside looked like nothing at all, like the life of any other village craftsman in an occupied backwater of the Roman Empire. The eternal Son of God, through whom the galaxies were flung into being, spent 10 times as long in silent, faithful, unnoticed obedience as he spent in the 3 short years of ministry that would go on to change the entire course of human history. 10 times as long in the shadows as in the light. And that ratio alone, if we let it, should tell us something staggering about how God values the hidden yes, the unseen faithfulness, the obedience that no one applauds because no one even knows it is happening. 30 years of it, 30 quiet years before anything the world would ever call significant. So we take 30 lessons, one for each of those hidden years, if you like. 30 windows into what actually happens inside a person. Inside their mind, their heart, their character, their very soul, when they finally stop negotiating with God and start trusting Him enough to simply do what He says. And I want to be completely honest with you at the very start about why all of this matters so urgently, because the word obedience has been damaged. It has been badly damaged, and we have to name that damage before we can heal it. It has been damaged by people who used it as a weapon, who wielded it to control and to dominate and to shame. It has been damaged by religious systems that took a word meant to describe love and turned it into a performance, a treadmill, An endless, anxious striving to become good enough for a God they secretly suspected was perpetually disappointed in them. It has been damaged by the memory of harsh authorities who demanded raw compliance and called it obedience. The parent who wanted control and dressed it up as godliness. The institution that wanted conformity and baptized it in spiritual language. The leader who quietly confused submission to God with submission to themselves. And so it is no wonder that when many people hear this word today, something inside them tightens. Something braces for impact. Something old and wounded whispers, "Here it comes again. Here comes the part where I am told one more time that I am not enough." If that is you, if the word itself makes your shoulders rise up toward your ears, if it summons the ghost of every person who ever used your desire to be good against you, then I am particularly glad that you are here. Because that is not what the Bible means by obedience, not at its root, not in its true and original and unspoiled form. The obedience God calls us to is not the cowering compliance of a servant who is afraid of the whip. It is the trusting responsiveness of a child who has learned slowly and over time, through 10,000 small experiences, that the Father's voice always leads somewhere good. It is not the surrender of a prisoner to a captor. It is the glad yes of a beloved to the one who loves them. And these 30 lessons ahead of us are going to take that damaged, wounded, misused word, and one careful lesson at a time, restore it, until you can hold it in your open hands again without flinching, and perhaps by the end, even come to love it. Before we go one step further, I want to pause and simply acknowledge you, the specific, particular person listening to this right now. Not a crowd, not an audience, not a statistic on a screen. You personally, made a choice to be here, to give these hours to something that asks more of you than mindless distraction ever would. And that single choice already tells me something deeply true about the current state of your heart. You are hungry for something real. You are tired, perhaps more tired than you have admitted to anyone, of living in the shallow water of a faith that never seems to go deep enough to actually change anything. You have sensed, maybe for a very long time now, that there is a deeper way to walk with God than the one you have been walking, a truer and richer and more alive way, and something in you is quietly, persistently reaching for it. I want you to know that this reaching is seen, that this hunger is honored, that it is itself a gift, a work of grace already stirring in you before you understood what it was. And over these next hours, I believe with everything in me that it is going to be met. If this channel has ever been a place where you found something true, a moment of unexpected peace in the middle of a hard week, a single verse that landed at exactly the right time, an understanding of Scripture that went deeper than you expected it to go, then I want to ask you one simple thing. Just one. Nothing else competing for your attention right now, no long list of requests, only this. Please subscribe. That is the whole ask. And I want to tell you plainly and without any complication that it costs you absolutely nothing at all. It is completely free. Not a single cent, not a commitment that binds you, not even 30 seconds of your time that you will ever notice missing. But here is what that one small tap quietly protects. The next teaching we make is going to arrive. It is already being prayed over, already being prepared. And if you are not subscribed, the simple and unfortunate reality is that you will most likely not be here when it comes. It will arrive and it will pass, and you will never even know that it existed. And the word that God might have used to meet you in that particular week, in whatever you will be walking through by then, will quietly pass you by. Subscribing is nothing more than the way you keep a steady place to return to. A quiet room you can come back to again and again, each week, when the world outside has worn you thin, and you need somewhere to be still and to hear the truth spoken over you once more. So if you have not yet, simply tap the subscribe button just below this video. That is all it takes. That is the entire thing. And then, if you would do one more small and quiet thing down in the comments, drop a single word, just one, for whatever it is you are carrying into this teaching today. The weight you are hoping over these hours together to finally set down and leave behind. You do not have to explain it. You do not have to justify it or make it sound acceptable. Just name it honestly in one word. And then watch what happens as the comments slowly fill with the honest, one-word burdens of people scattered all over the world who came here carrying the very same kinds of things that you carry. The griefs, the fears, the regrets, the exhaustions. You will see that you are not alone in this. You never were. You never have been. Now, let us begin the 30. Let us open the very first door. Lesson 1. Obedience is how trust becomes real. There is a difference between saying you trust someone and actually trusting them. And the difference is always, without exception, revealed in the single moment they ask you to do something you would never have chosen on your own. We say we trust God easily. We say it constantly. We sing it in our worship songs, with our eyes closed and our hands lifted. We write it on the walls of our homes and in the margins of our journals. We tell other people, especially in the comfortable seasons when nothing at all is being asked of us, that we trust the Lord with our whole hearts, that we have surrendered everything, that He can have it all. And it is not that we are lying when we say these things. It is that trust, until the moment it is actually tested, remains nothing more than a theory. It is an idea we hold about ourselves rather than a reality we have lived. It is a flattering self-portrait we have painted and hung on the wall of our own imagination. And obedience is the exact and precise point at which the theory becomes real, or reveals, sometimes painfully, that it was never quite as solid as we had believed. Consider Abraham, the man whom the Scripture goes so far as to call the friend of God, the father of all who would ever believe. God spoke to him and said, in the earliest and most defining of the commands that would shape the whole of his long life, "Get thee out of thy country and from thy kindred and from thy father's house, unto a land that I will show thee." Now notice very carefully what God did not do. He did not show Abraham the land first and then ask him to go to it. He did not provide a map, an itinerary, a survey of the territory, a list of guarantees, a preview of the destination and its comforts. He said go, and he deliberately withheld the where. The obedience had to come first. The knowing came only afterward, on the far side of the yes. And this, if you begin to look for it, is almost always the shape of the thing. The yes is required before the reason is revealed, because if the reason were revealed first, then the yes would no longer be trust at all. It would merely be agreement. It would be the simple calculation of a person who has already seen the outcome, weighed it, and judged it acceptable to their own interests. That is not faith. That is bookkeeping. Real trust operates precisely in the gap, the dark, uncomfortable, faith-demanding gap between the command and the comprehension. It says yes before it understands why, and that yes, spoken out into the darkness before the first light of understanding has broken over the horizon, is the truest and most valuable thing a human being can possibly offer to God, because it is the offering of the will itself, the very center of the self, unbribed by certainty and unpurchased by proof. It is the one gift we can give that costs us the thing we most want to keep, which is control. Here is what this means for you tonight, wherever you are sitting. If you have been waiting to understand before you will obey, if you have been standing at a standstill, waiting for God to explain himself fully, to make the entire path clear from beginning to end, to resolve every one of your questions and satisfy every one of your objections, before you take the single step he has already made perfectly plain to you, then you may be waiting for something that he has lovingly and deliberately refused to give you. And he has refused it precisely because giving it to you would rob you of the very trust he is trying, with such patience, to build in you. The unclarity you resent is not God being cruel or distant or withholding. It is God making room for faith to exist at all. The step you can already see the full reason for requires no faith whatsoever. Any calculating person would take it. It is only the step into the fog, the step where the next stone beneath your foot is not yet visible, that turns the theory of trust into the hard and durable fact of it. And something genuinely happens inside a person when they take that kind of step. Something is forged in the taking of it that could be forged in no other way. The muscle of trust, which grows only under real load and never in comfort, begins at last to grow. You become, by slow degrees and one obedience at a time, a person who knows from lived experience, not from sermons, not from theory, not from other people's testimonies, but from the actual scar tissue of your own obedience, that the God who called you into the fog was standing and waiting for you on the other side of it the whole time. He was never absent. He was only ahead. That is the very first thing obedience does, and it is the foundation for everything else that will follow across these 30 lessons. It takes the word trust down out of your mouth, where it floats so easily and costs so little, and it drives that word down deep into your bones, into the load-bearing structure of who you are, where it can finally, at last, hold real weight when the real weight comes. Lesson 2, obedience reveals what you actually believe. You do not find out what you truly believe by carefully examining your thoughts. You find out what you truly believe by honestly examining your actions, because your actions are simply your beliefs made visible, your convictions dragged out of the shadows of the mind and into the daylight of the world. Everything else, every stated position, every sincere intention, every heartfelt claim, is merely commentary on the real text which is written in what you actually do. This is one of the hardest and at the same time most clarifying truths in all of Scripture, and it runs directly and uncomfortably against the way we very much prefer to understand ourselves. We prefer, all of us, to define ourselves by our intentions. We prefer to be judged by what we meant, by what we hoped, by what we sincerely and privately wished were true of us. And there is, thank God, a real mercy in the fact that He alone sees the heart and knows the intention behind the deed. But there is also a searching, unavoidable honesty in the way the Bible insists, again and again and again, that genuine living faith produces obedience the way a living, healthy tree produces fruit, not by straining and grunting and forcing, but simply and naturally by the fact of its being alive. Faith, if it hath not works, is dead being alone, wrote James, the brother of Jesus, in one of the most bracing and bone-honest lines in the entire New Testament. Now hear him carefully. He was not saying that our works save us. He would have been horrified at the suggestion. He was saying something else, something more diagnostic. He was saying that a faith which produces no obedience whatsoever is not a small faith or a weak faith, or a struggling, immature faith that simply needs to grow. It is a dead faith. It is a faith with no life in it at all, because the very life of faith, its heartbeat and its breath, expresses itself in the doing. Think of it in the plainest possible terms. If a man stands before you and tells you, with complete sincerity and evident conviction, that he believes the bridge in front of him will hold his weight, but then he refuses, under any circumstances, to actually step out onto it, does he believe it? He may say the words, he may even feel the corresponding feelings, some warm, inner sense of confidence. But his flat refusal to place his foot on the bridge reveals that at the level where belief actually operates and actually matters, the deep level that governs action, that moves the body, that commits the whole self, he does not believe it at all. His feet are more honest than his mouth. And if another man crosses that same bridge every single morning without so much as a second thought, his belief is demonstrated and proven in every step he takes, whether or not he ever once articulates it in words. Belief, in the end, lives in the feet far more than it lives in the mouth. Obedience, then, is not the enemy of faith, and it is not some lesser secondary add-on bolted onto the outside of it. Obedience is faith itself, walking. It is belief that has finally traveled the long and difficult 18 inches from the head down to the hands. And this, once you truly grasp it, is enormously freeing, though it may not sound freeing at all when you first hear it. It is freeing because it means you do not have to wait until you feel a certain way in order to obey. You do not have to somehow manufacture a perfect internal state of unwavering, feeling-drenched conviction before you are permitted to act. You simply obey, and the very act of obeying itself deepens the believing. The action feeds the faith that produced it, and that strengthened faith produces further action in a rising spiral that grows stronger and steadier and more unshakable with every single turn. So if you have been tormented by doubt, if you have been lying awake at night wondering whether your faith is even real because your feelings about God keep flickering and guttering like a candle in a draught, bright one week and nearly out the next, then here, right here, is the door out of that torment, and I want you to walk through it. Stop trying to feel your way into certainty. It rarely works, and it can take years, and it may never come at all by that road. Instead, start obeying your way into it. Do the next thing God has already made clear to you. Then, when that is done, do the one after that. And you will find, when you look back over a whole season of these small and often unremarkable obediences, that a faith you were genuinely not sure you even possessed has quietly, without announcement, grown roots. Real roots, deep roots, roots you can now stand on when the storm comes and the wind rises and your feelings blow away like leaves. Obedience does not merely reveal what you believe. It waters it, and it strengthens it, and it grows it into something living and rooted that can weather the storms your feelings on their own never could. Lesson 3. Obedience is the doorway to intimacy. We come now to something that changes absolutely everything, something that sits at the very heart of why obedience matters at all. And if you were to take nothing else away from these entire 30 lessons, I would plead with you to take this one and hold it close for the rest of your life. On the last night before he died, in the borrowed upper room, with the crushing weight of the coming cross already pressing down upon him, with betrayal already walking out the door and into the night, Jesus said something to his disciples that we tend to rush right past, because it sounds, on the thin surface of it, like nothing more than a simple condition, a transaction, an if-then. He said, "He that hath my commandments and keepeth them, he it is that loveth me. And he that loveth me shall be loved of my Father, and I will love him, and will manifest myself to him." And then, only a moment later, as if to make sure they had not missed it, he said it again in even more astonishing terms. "If a man love me, he will keep my words, and my Father will love him, and we will come unto him, and make our abode with him." Read that again, slowly, and let it be as strange to you as it actually is, because it is staggering. Jesus is not saying in these words that obedience earns God's love, as though love were a wage to be worked for. That love was already, in that very moment, flowing toward these confused and frightened men, already on the verge of being poured out for them on a cross the very next day, while they were still failing and doubting and about to scatter. No. He is saying something far more intimate and far more mysterious and far more wonderful than a transaction. He is saying that obedience is the means by which he manifests himself to us, that the keeping of his word is the very doorway through which he and the Father come and make their home, their abode, their permanent dwelling place, the Greek word suggesting a settled and lasting residence, not a passing visit, inside an actual human life. Obedience, in other words, is not the wall standing between you and intimacy with God, as we so often secretly feel it to be. It is the door that opens into that intimacy. It is the way in. And here is why this is so, why it could not be any other way. Intimacy with any person, with anyone at all, requires alignment. It requires two lives moving, however imperfectly, in the same direction. You cannot be deeply, truly close to a person while consistently and knowingly doing the exact opposite of what matters most to them, of what they have told you, lies at the very center of who they are. And this is not because they coldly punish you for the disregard, withdrawing their affection as a penalty. It is something far more organic than punishment. It is that the very act of disregarding someone's heart creates a distance between you that no amount of warm sentiment or good feeling can ever close. Two people walking briskly in opposite directions cannot hold a conversation for very long, no matter how loudly they profess to love one another, no matter how sincere the profession. The distance itself does the separating. And to walk with God, to actually walk with Him, in step in the same direction, close enough to hear the low sound of His voice and feel the warmth of His nearness, requires that we turn and go the way that He is going. That turning, that deliberate and repeated stepping into alignment with His heart and His character and His ways, is precisely what obedience is. And on the far side of that turning is a closeness with God, that persistent, chosen disobedience makes not merely difficult, but literally, structurally impossible. Not because God angrily withdraws Himself from us, but because we, by our own steps, have simply walked out of the room where He is and into another room and shut the door behind us. This one truth reframes the entire subject, and I hope you feel it reframing something in you even now. The person who sees obedience as a heavy and joyless burden has simply not yet understood that it is, in fact, the one pathway that leads directly into the presence they most deeply and desperately long for. Every single act of obedience is a step deeper into the room where God dwells. Every quiet yes is a movement toward the warm and living fire of His nearness. And this is why, if you study the lives of the men and women throughout the long history of the faith who have known God most intimately, the ones whose very faces seemed somehow to shine, whose simple words carried a weight and an authority that mere human cleverness could never manufacture or counterfeit, you find, without a single exception, that they were people of deep and costly and unglamorous obedience. Not because they somehow earned their intimacy with God as a prize for good behavior, but because they walked, faithfully and for many years, the one road that actually leads to it. And that same road is still open. It has never once been closed. It is open tonight to you, beginning with whatever it is that you already, in your heart of hearts, know He is asking of you, and have not yet done. Lesson 4. Obedience protects you from harm. You cannot see a good and loving father does not stop to explain every single rule to a very young child, and this is not because he is withholding or authoritarian. It is because the child does not yet possess and cannot yet possess the capacity to understand the danger that the rule is quietly guarding against. When you tell a 2-year-old firmly not to touch the hot stove, you do not deliver to that child a detailed lecture on the thermodynamics of thermal burns, on the fragility and delicacy of young skin, on the way that nerve damage propagates through tissue, on the long and frightening hours in a hospital emergency room that could so easily follow a single moment of curiosity. You do not say any of that, because the child could not understand a word of it. You simply say no. You say it firmly, and if necessary, you say it again and again, and the child, who cannot possibly grasp what you, standing above them, can see with perfect clarity, must either trust you and pull back their hand, or distrust you and reach out toward the flame. The whole of that child's safety in that critical moment rests not on their understanding, which is entirely absent, but on their obedience. And the very love that issued the command is precisely and exactly what makes the command non-negotiable, urgent, and repeated. Now lift your eyes for a moment and consider, really consider, that you are, in relation to God, far more like that small 2-year-old than you would ever prefer to admit to yourself. It stings to say it, but it is true. God sees the entire landscape of consequence that every one of your choices sets silently in motion, the whole spreading tree of outcomes branching out across years and decades that you cannot see even one season into. He sees the friendship that will, slowly and imperceptibly, poison you from the inside. He sees the opportunity that glitters so brightly on the surface and rots quietly at the core. He sees the path that looks, from where you are standing, exactly like freedom, and that ends, around a bend you cannot see past, in a locked cage. He sees the indulgence that whispers a promise of life, and delivers instead, by slow and pleasant-feeling degrees, a kind of death. He sees the stove. You see, at your very best, on your most discerning day, a warm and interesting and inviting glow. And a great many of the commands of God that strike us as needlessly restrictive, as arbitrary, as puzzling, as God unfairly withholding some good thing from us for reasons of his own, a great many of them are, in reality, nothing other than the loving and urgent voice of a father saying no to a specific danger that we are genuinely, completely incapable of perceiving from where we presently stand. The book of Proverbs is absolutely saturated, from beginning to end, with exactly this understanding of the commands of God. Over and over and over, it describes them not as burdens laid upon us, but as protection thrown around us. As a lamp held out for the feet in a very dark and dangerous place, as strong walls encircling and defending a city, as the wise and loving boundary that keeps a whole life from tipping over into ruin. There is a way which seemeth right unto a man, it warns, with a chill that ought to run down the spine, but the end thereof are the ways of death. Seemeth right. Read those 2 words again. The path looked right. It looked good and reasonable and even wise. The reasoning behind it felt entirely sound. Every individual step along it appeared to lead somewhere better than the last. And that precisely is the whole nature of the trap, the very heart of the danger, that the road to destruction almost never announces itself honestly as the road to destruction. It does not come wearing a warning label. It comes carefully disguised as the reasonable choice, the deserved choice, the mature and obvious choice that any sensible adult would naturally make. And obedience to God is, again and again and again, across 1,000 quiet decisions, the one thing that keeps a person off of that road. Not because they saw the hidden danger themselves and wisely avoided it, but because they trusted the one who could see it and who said no. I want to say this next part very gently, but also very directly to one particular person who is listening right now. And you will know if it is you. You are standing at this moment right at the edge of a decision you have already, in your heart, half made. It is a decision that you know, in the quiet and honest place beneath all your arguments, that God has clearly and lovingly said no to. And you are here in part, looking for permission to proceed anyway, looking for someone to tell you it will be all right. So hear this instead, spoken in love. The no that you are right now resisting so hard may very well be the single most loving thing that anyone has said to you in years. It may be a strong hand placed flat against your chest, holding you back from the edge of a cliff whose bottom you cannot see from where you stand. Obedience here in this exact moment is not God spoiling your fun or begrudging you your happiness. It is God saving your life. And years from now, on the far side of the obedience that will cost you something tonight, you may look back on this very moment with a flood of gratitude so deep that it brings tears to your eyes, understanding at last, with perfect and grateful clarity, exactly what you were spared, exactly what disaster you never had to walk through, because you trusted him enough to obey when you could not yet see why. That is the fourth thing obedience does. It guards you from harm you are not yet able to see, and very often you never do see it, because obedience meant that it never touched you at all, that it remained forever a disaster that almost was, and then, quietly, was not. Lesson 5. Obedience turns knowledge into wisdom. There is a vast and often unnoticed difference between merely knowing something and actually being wise, and the entire bridge between those two very different things is built, plank by plank. Out of nothing but obedience, you can know a truly enormous amount about God and remain, at the same time, a complete fool. This is one of the more sobering and humbling realities that the Scripture quietly insists upon, and it ought to give every one of us pause, especially those of us who have spent years accumulating religious information. Knowledge can be acquired by anyone at all who has the time and the inclination for it, the theology carefully absorbed, the verses committed to memory, the doctrines understood and systematized, the arguments studied and mastered and deployed in debate. And none of it, not 1 ounce of it by itself, produces a single grain of actual wisdom. Wisdom is simply not the same thing as knowledge. Wisdom is knowledge lived, it is knowledge obeyed. It is knowledge that has been walked out over years in the actual dust and difficulty and pressure of a real human life, until it has become something far more than mere information stored in the mind, until it has become a way of being, a settled character, a seasoned instinct for the good. Jesus himself closed the greatest sermon that has ever been preached in the history of the world with exactly this distinction, and he drove it home with an image no one who heard it ever forgot. He described 2 men who built 2 houses. And notice carefully the one crucial detail. Both of them heard the very same words. Both of them had identical, complete access to the identical teaching. Nothing was given to one that was withheld from the other. The entire difference between these 2 men, the difference on which their whole future turned, was not what they knew. It was what they did with what they knew. Whosoever heareth these sayings of mine, and doeth them, Jesus said, I will liken him unto a wise man, which built his house upon a rock. And the other man, who heard the exact same sayings and did not do them, he likened to a foolish man who built his house upon the sand. The rock and the sand were not 2 different sets of information. They were the very same information, obeyed in the one case and not obeyed in the other. The doing was the rock. The merely hearing was the sand. And when the storm came, as the storm always comes, sooner or later, to every house that was ever built, the house of the merely knowing collapsed with a great crash, while the house of the obedient stood firm through the wind and the flood and the beating rain. This is precisely why some of the wisest and most spiritually substantial people you will ever have the privilege to meet have read remarkably few books, and why some of the most educated and credentialed are, in the ways that finally and eternally matter most, foolish. Wisdom is not downloaded into a person like a file. It is forged in them slowly, in the hot furnace of obedience, over long years of doing what God says, in the specific situations where doing it actually costs something real. The person who has quietly obeyed God through 100 hard and unglamorous decisions possesses a depth of wisdom that no amount of study, however diligent, could ever have produced in them, because they hold knowledge that has been tested under real fire and been found again and again to hold its shape and bear the weight. They know, not merely as an abstract proposition, but as a lived and personal certainty, that God is faithful. And more than that, They know how his faithfulness actually behaves in the middle of a genuine crisis. They know not merely the doctrine that his ways are higher than ours, but the specific felt texture of how those higher ways tend to unfold across an ordinary, difficult, faith-testing week. So if you long to be wise, and let me say gently that the very longing for wisdom is itself already a mark of grace beginning its quiet work in you, then understand clearly that the path to it does not run primarily through the acquisition of yet more information. You very likely already know far, far more than you currently obey. That is true of nearly all of us. The path to real wisdom runs, instead, straight through the doing of what you already know. Take the truth you are already fully sure of. Not some advanced or hidden truth, but the plain and simple truth already lit up clearly in your conscience. And live it completely in the exact place where you actually are. And watch it begin to deepen from something you merely know into something you have become. That is the quiet alchemy of obedience. It takes the base lead of mere knowledge and slowly, patiently transforms it into the pure gold of a wisdom that can hold an entire life together when everything around it and everything within it is shaking. Lesson 6. Obedience is worship. More costly than any song, we have made worship small. Over time, almost without noticing it, we have shrunk the great and total concept of worship down until it means, for most people, little more than the 20 minutes of music at the beginning of a church service. The songs we sing together with our eyes closed and our hands lifted and our hearts for a few moments genuinely moved. And that is worship, truly it is. I do not want to take that from you or diminish it, but it is, if we are honest, the least costly kind of worship there is. It is the kind that asks the very least of us, because it is not particularly hard to sing that God is Lord while standing in a warm room full of people who already agree with you, accompanied by music that has been skillfully engineered to stir your emotions. The real question, the searching question that reveals whether any of that singing meant anything at all, is what you do on Monday morning. What you do when the music has stopped and the room is empty, and the command of God is suddenly inconvenient and costly, and nobody at all is watching to see whether you will keep it. The prophet Samuel once spoke words to King Saul that have echoed down through all the centuries since as one of the great and permanent correctives to every form of shallow substitutionary religion. Saul had directly disobeyed a clear command of God, and then, this is the part we must not miss, he had attempted to cover over and paper over his disobedience with an elaborate offering of worship. He had kept back the best of the animals from what God had explicitly told him to destroy, intending, so he claimed, and perhaps even sincerely believed, to sacrifice them to the Lord in a grand act of devotion. And Samuel cut straight through the whole performance with a single sentence that ought to be carved in stone over the door of every church and every heart. Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to hearken than the fat of rams. To obey is better than sacrifice. The costly-looking, impressive-seeming religious offering meant precisely nothing to God, was worth nothing in his sight, because it was being used, consciously or not, as a substitute for the one and only thing he had actually asked for, which was simple obedience. Saul wanted desperately to give God a spectacular and memorable worship service in the place of a plain and humbling obedience. And God was not fooled by the exchange. He is never fooled by that exchange. He sees straight through it every time. This exposes something deep in us that we would very much rather not have to see. It is very often far easier to give God dramatic religious activity than to give him simple, daily, unglamorous obedience. It is easier, and it feels holier, to attend the powerful conference than to actually forgive the brother who wronged us. It is easier to raise both hands high in the emotional song than to lower our voice in the middle of the argument at home. It is easier to write the check than to release the resentment we have been nursing for months. It is easier to fast dramatically for a whole week than to simply hold our sharp tongue for a single difficult afternoon. We would so much rather offer God the sacrifice of our own choosing, on our own terms, in a form that makes us feel devout, than offer him the specific, unchosen, humbling obedience of his asking. And he, in his deep love and his refusal to be flattered, keeps gently declining the trade, not because he does not want our worship. He made us to worship, and worship is our highest joy, but because he wants worship that is real, and the very realest worship there is, the worship that costs the most and pleases him the most, is the kind that costs us our own will. But here is the beautiful and liberating turn hidden inside all of this, the door that swings open once you see it. When you finally understand that obedience itself is worship, the highest and most costly worship there is, then the most ordinary and unremarkable moments of your entire life suddenly become sacred, become holy, become an altar. The quiet choice to be honest when a small lie would be so much easier and smoother, that is worship, a genuine offering laid on the altar. The choice to serve when you would very much rather be served, to stay when everything in you wants to leave, to speak the kind word when the cruel and clever one is already loaded and aimed and ready on your tongue. Every single one of these ordinary choices becomes an altar, an offering, a song sung not with your lips, but with your life. Your whole existence, lived this way, becomes a place of continuous worship, not merely the 20 minutes of music on a Sunday, but the 24 hours of real choices that make up every ordinary day. And that kind of worship, the costly kind, the Monday kind, the kind that no one sees and no one applauds and no band accompanies, that is the very worship that God treasures most of all. Because it is the worship that costs you the one thing you are most tempted always to keep back for yourself. It costs you your own way. Lesson 7. Obedience breaks the power of sin's deception. Sin never once announces itself honestly as sin. If it did, if it came to us wearing its true face and speaking its true name, then no one on earth would ever choose it, not once. Instead, sin always comes to us carefully cloaked in a promise, and the promise underneath all its endless disguises is always some version of the very same ancient lie, the oldest lie there is, that stepping outside of God's clear command will somehow make you freer and fuller and more alive than staying inside it ever could. And obedience is precisely how you break the dark spell of that lie. Not primarily by arguing with it in your head, which rarely works, but by simply refusing to act on it, holding the line until its falseness is finally and fully exposed by the passage of time and the light of truth. The very first temptation recorded in all of the Bible was constructed from the ground up, entirely out of this one deception, and it is worth studying closely because the blueprint has never changed. The serpent did not say to the woman in the garden, "Come, do evil. Come, harm yourself and everyone who will ever come after you. Come, invite death and ruin into the whole world." Of course it did not. No one would have listened for a moment. It said, in effect, something far more subtle and far more effective. God is holding out on you. There is more life available to you than he is willing to let you have. This command of his that you are keeping is not really protection at all. It is restriction. It is not love. It is control. And if you will only step across it, if you will only reach out and take what he has forbidden, then your eyes will be opened, and you shall be as gods. The entire strategy, start to finish, was to reframe a catastrophic act of ruin as a bold and liberating act of self-actualization, to make a cage look like a doorway to freedom, and to make the doorway to real freedom look, by contrast, like a cage that only cowards would agree to stay inside. And every single temptation since that first one, right down to the one you may be facing this very week, has followed the exact same ancient blueprint without deviation. The pleasure that will, in the end, cost you absolutely everything is presented to you as the one thing that will finally make you whole. The disobedience that will slowly hollow you out from the inside is dressed up in flattering clothes as the bold, the authentic, the brave, the free choice. The choice that only small and fearful and repressed people are too timid to make. Obedience simply refuses the frame. It steps back, and it says quietly and firmly, I have already decided in advance, before the moment of testing, to trust that God's command is love, even when disobedience arrives dressed convincingly in the clothes of freedom. I will not be fooled by the costume. And here is what actually happens in the real world when a person holds that line. The deception, unable to become action, unable to be fed and acted upon, eventually loses its grip and its power. Because a lie only has real power over you for as long as you might still act on it. It lives on the possibility of your yes. The very moment you settle the matter completely, the moment you decide all the way down that no matter how compelling and reasonable and appealing the promise sounds, no matter how many times it returns, you simply will not step across the line that God has lovingly drawn. In that moment, the temptation begins to lose its strange hypnotic force. It keeps talking, yes, it may talk for years, but you have stopped listening to it as a set of live instructions you are still considering, and you have started listening to it merely as a person who already knows, beyond any doubt, exactly how this particular story ends. You have watched that road too many times. You have seen the glittering promise of freedom deliver its cargo of chains too often in your own life and in the lives of others to believe the advertisement anymore. This is how people actually get free, not usually in a single dramatic and cinematic moment of deliverance, though those moments do sometimes happen, but far more often through the slow, unspectacular, accumulated weight of many small obediences, each one exposing the old lie a little more completely than the last, until the thing that once seemed utterly irresistible finally seems, at long last, simply and obviously false. Obedience is how you patiently starve a deception until it dies of hunger. You stop feeding it your yes. You stop giving it the one thing it needs to survive, which is your cooperation. And a lie that is never once acted upon, held steadily and firmly in the clear light of God's truth over time, eventually withers and shrivels and loses all its color, until one ordinary day you suddenly realize, with a quiet and holy astonishment, that the very thing which once ruled you and enslaved you and seemed so powerful has no power over you at all anymore. None. That is what obedience does given time. It breaks the spell. It shows you by your own lived and undeniable experience that God was telling you the whole truth the entire time, and the tempter was lying to you the entire time, and that you were in fact free all along, free the very moment you finally chose to believe him instead of it. Lesson 8, Obedience Positions, you for blessing you didn't earn. We have to be very careful here, and I want to slow down, because this is the lesson that is most easily twisted, and it has in fact been twisted by a great many people into something ugly and false and spiritually poisonous. So let me say clearly and plainly what this lesson is not, before I say what it truly is. Obedience is not a vending machine. It is not a mechanical transaction in which you insert the coin of your good behavior at the top and a guaranteed product of health and wealth and comfort drops out reliably at the bottom. God is not a mechanism to be operated, and he does not owe you a comfortable and prosperous life in exchange for your compliance. Anyone who has ever told you that obedience to God guarantees financial wealth and physical ease and a life free of suffering has sold you a cheap counterfeit of the real thing, and life itself, often painfully, will eventually expose the fraud for what it is. Job obeyed and lost everything. The prophets obeyed, and many were killed for it. Jesus obeyed perfectly and was crucified, so let us have no illusions on this point. And yet, having said all of that clearly and firmly, we must be equally careful not to swing so far in correcting that error that we end up denying what the Scripture just as plainly and just as repeatedly affirms from Genesis to Revelation, that obedience genuinely does position a life to receive things that disobedience quietly forfeits and loses, not as earned payment, as positioning. There is a world of difference between those two ideas, and the difference is, in fact, the entire point of this lesson. Think of it in terms of a farmer, an image the Scripture itself reaches for again and again. The farmer who obeys the deep wisdom of the seasons, who plants his seed at the right time and not the wrong one, who waters and weeds and tends, who does the patient and unglamorous labor in its proper order and does not skip the hard parts. That farmer is not, by his obedience, buying or purchasing or earning a harvest. He cannot command the rain to fall. He cannot force a single buried seed to crack open and sprout by an act of his own will. The harvest, when at last it comes, is a gift, a grace, something he could never have manufactured or guaranteed by his own effort. And yet, and here is the whole point, his obedience to the way things actually work has carefully positioned him to receive that gift, in a way that the other man, the one who carelessly scattered his seed on the hard road and then slept through the entire planting season, simply is not positioned to receive it. Both men are equally dependent on grace, on sun and rain they cannot control. But only one of them is standing out in the field where the grace actually falls. The other is asleep indoors, and the rain that comes does him no good at all. This is the consistent biblical pattern of blessing, and it runs like a bright thread from the very first pages of the Scripture to the very last. God pours out his goodness upon the obedient, not because they have somehow earned it or deserved it. No one earns the goodness of God. It is grace from beginning to end. But because obedience places a life squarely in the path of that goodness. The one who obeys God's design for honest and diligent work finds, over the long course of years, that a certain kind of fruitfulness and stability tends to accumulate, which the habitually dishonest and lazy simply forfeit. The one who obeys God's clear call to open-handed generosity discovers a strange and unexpected joy, and very often a provision, that the tightly closed and grasping hand never once knows or tastes. The one who obeys God in the faithful keeping of their word becomes, over the slow accumulation of years, a person that others can genuinely trust and rely upon. And a whole life built on that foundation of trust bears a kind of fruit that a life built on manipulation and broken promises never can and never will. None of it, not a bit of it, is earned. All of it is received. But it is received, as a matter of plain observation, by those who are standing through their obedience in the very place where it tends to fall. So do not ever obey God in order to get something from him. That single motive corrupts the whole beautiful thing and turns love into cold commerce, turns a father into a business partner. But do understand, and let it encourage you when obedience feels like nothing but loss, that obedience is not, in fact, a loss, not a subtraction from your life, not a grim and joyless sacrifice of all the good things that life might otherwise have offered you. It is the careful positioning of your entire life within the flowing current of God's own goodness, so that when his blessing does flow in its own perfect time and in its own often surprising form, frequently in ways you would never in 100 years have predicted, you are found standing exactly where it can reach you and pour over you. The obedient life is the open hand, held out and waiting beneath the waterfall. It does not and cannot create the water, but it catches and receives what the closed and clenched fist never possibly could. Lesson 9. Obedience in small things prepares you for large ones. No one is ever handed a mountain to move before they have first been faithful with a molehill. This is not God being stingy with us, or arbitrarily making us wait, or dangling the significant assignment just out of reach to test our patience. It is God being wise, and it is God being kind, because the deep capacity to be trusted with much is built entirely and without any shortcut out of proven faithfulness in little. There is simply no other way to build it, and there is no way around the building. Jesus stated this principle with perfect and unmistakable clarity, and once you have heard it, you cannot unhear it. He that is faithful in that which is least is faithful also in much, and he that is unjust in the least is unjust also in much. Read that slowly and let it land, because it describes a law of the spiritual and moral life every bit as reliable and unbreakable as the law of gravity itself. The person you truly are in the small, the unseen, the unglamorous, the entirely unwitnessed obediences, that is the exact same person you will inevitably be when the stakes are suddenly enormous and the whole watching world is looking on. Character does not magically and suddenly appear fully formed at the moment the big test arrives. It cannot. Character is simply what you have already been quietly building, or else quietly neglecting and eroding, across 10,000 small and hidden moments that no one but God ever noticed. The great and public moment does not create your character out of nothing. It only reveals, mercilessly and accurately, the character that the 10,000 small moments already built. And yet we tend, all of us, to despise the small obediences. We unconsciously look right past them, hungry for something bigger. We want the significant assignment, the dramatic and visible calling, the mountain-moving, crowd-gathering faith, and we grow impatient and even resentful with the molehills. The daily and repetitive disciplines, the unseen and unthanked kindnesses, the private integrity that no one will ever know about, the small and endlessly repeated yeses that no one will ever stand up and applaud. We imagine quietly and flatteringly that we surely would be faithful in the great thing if only God would hurry up and hand us a great thing to be faithful in. But this is precisely, exactly backwards, and it keeps countless people stuck for their entire lives. God gives the great thing to the person who has already proven, over years in the small and hidden things, that they can be trusted with it. The faithfulness always comes first. The largeness comes only afterward, if at all. And the person who is standing around, waiting for a large and important assignment before they will consent to be faithful in the small ones, will, in the end, wait forever, because they have the divine order exactly reversed, and they are asking God to violate the very way that He builds a soul. Consider, if you will, just how much of the deep training of the great figures of Scripture happened in total obscurity, in smallness, in the faithful and patient doing of entirely unremarkable and unwitnessed things. David was faithful in tending a few dozen smelly sheep out in a lonely field, year after year, long before he was ever trusted with a whole nation and its throne. And it was precisely out there, alone in that field, entirely unwatched by any human eye, that he killed the lion and the bear that no one but God ever saw him face, quietly building the very courage and the very trust in God that he would one day need in the valley of Elah, where all of Israel was watching and everything hung in the balance. Joseph was faithful as a lowly household servant, and then faithful even as an unjustly accused prisoner in a forgotten dungeon, doing his unglamorous and thankless work with genuine excellence when no earthly reward was anywhere in sight and every promise seemed broken. For long, slow, testing years before he was ever faithful as the second most powerful ruler in all of Egypt, saving nations from famine. In every single case, the faithfulness in the small and hidden and painful place was not some frustrating delay standing in the way of their real calling. It was the very making of the person, that their real calling would one day require them to be. So I want, with everything in me, to lift the heavy weight of impatience clean off of you if you happen to be in a small and hidden and unseen season right now, faithfully doing things that no one notices or thanks you for, quietly wondering, sometimes with an ache, when your real life is finally going to begin. Please hear this, and let it sink all the way in. Your real life has already begun. This is it. This is not the boring waiting room before the real thing. This hidden faithfulness right now is not the tedious prelude before the assignment finally arrives. It is the assignment. It is the forge, the very furnace in which the metal of your soul is being shaped and hardened and made ready. And every single small obedience you offer in the dark, where no one but God can see it, is building in you a capacity that will one day be able to hold weight you cannot yet even imagine or picture. So be faithful in the least, not grudgingly, and not because the least is somehow all there will ever be for you, but because faithfulness in the least is the very thing, the only thing that prepares a soul to be trusted in time with much. Do not despise your molehills. You are learning on them quietly and unglamorously, day by hidden day, how to move mountains. Lesson 10. Obedience is how you learn the voice of God. We are now a full third of the way through our 30 lessons, and I want to slow us down here and dwell for a while on something profoundly and immediately practical. Something that people ask me about constantly in every season and every place, and yet something they very rarely receive a clear and satisfying answer to. How do I actually hear God's voice? How do I know that it is really Him speaking, and not just my own thoughts, my own desires, my own fears, all of them wearing His name like a mask? And the answer, which almost no one expects and which upends how we usually approach the question, is this. You learn to recognize the voice of God, primarily and fundamentally, by obeying the part of it that you already recognize. Here is why that is so. A voice, any voice, becomes deeply familiar to us only through relationship, through repeated shared experience over time. And relationship with God, like every real relationship, deepens specifically through obedience. Consider the picture Jesus Himself painted. The sheep, He taught, know the shepherd's voice, but not because they once sat down and studied it carefully in the abstract, analyzing its qualities from a safe distance. They know it because they have followed it. Day after day, through gate after gate, out of the fold and into pasture after pasture, back again at evening, over and over across the seasons, until the particular sound of that one voice is simply written into them, unmistakable, instantly distinguishable from the voice of the stranger whom they will not follow and instinctively flee. "My sheep hear my voice," Jesus said, "and I know them, and they follow me." Now notice the order of it, because the order is everything. The hearing and the following are bound together, wound around each other, inseparable. You do not first somehow achieve perfect, settled clarity about the voice, and only then, once you are certain, begin to follow. No. You begin to follow the voice that you can already make out, however faintly, however imperfectly, and it is precisely in the following that the voice grows clearer and easier to recognize. Most people, though, have this whole thing exactly and tragically backwards, and it keeps them stuck for years, sometimes for their whole lives. They are waiting to obey until they are first completely certain that it is God. And so, because that airtight certainty rarely comes on its own, they never actually obey. And so, because they never obey, they never once develop the deep familiarity that the certainty they are demanding actually requires and depends upon. And so they remain trapped, sometimes for decades, in a thick and frustrating fog of their own making, always analyzing, endlessly weighing, forever second-guessing, but never simply following. And because they are never following, they grow no closer at all to recognizing the voice. For recognition comes only and ever through the relationship that obedience alone builds. Meanwhile, the other person, the one who simply obeys the clearest thing in front of them, the command they already plainly know, the conviction they cannot honestly escape, the plain instruction of Scripture that requires no special discernment or mystical guidance whatsoever to understand, that person is, without even fully realizing it, enrolled in the finest possible course in learning the voice of God. Every prompting obeyed tunes the ear a little finer. Every act of following calibrates the instrument a little more precisely, and over months and years, they quietly develop something that simply cannot be taught in any classroom or gained from any book. A trained, tested, battle-proven, reliable sense of the shepherd's own particular voice, so that they can tell it from all the others. So if you genuinely want to hear God more clearly, and I suspect that longing is part of why you are here at all, then stop standing and waiting at the locked door of perfect certainty, waiting for a key that door was never going to give you, and instead start walking through all the doors that are already standing wide open in front of you. Obey what you already know for certain. Do the thing that Scripture makes plain and undeniable. Follow the prompting that you are already reasonably sure of, even if you are not completely sure. And as you do this, faithfully over time, you will find, not always immediately, but surely and increasingly, that the fog itself begins to thin and lift, that the voice begins to sharpen and clarify, that a discernment you could never have manufactured through analysis or striving begins quietly to grow in you. The voice of God is learned in exactly the same way that any beloved and familiar voice is learned, not by studying it clinically from across a distance, but by walking close beside it, for long enough, through enough shared experience, that in the end you would know it anywhere, in any crowd, in any darkness. Obedience is that walk. It is the long walk by which the sheep slowly come to know the shepherd, and it is the very walk by which you too will come at last to know him, not as a stranger whose voice you strain to identify, but as the one whose voice you would recognize anywhere because you have followed it so far for so long. Lesson 11. Obedience dethrones the tyranny of self. At the very center of the human problem, underneath every symptom and every surface trouble, there lies a single stubborn ancient fact. We want to be our own gods. We want to sit securely on the throne of our own lives. We want to be the final authority, the highest court, the ultimate reference point. We want our own will to be the thing that, in the end, actually decides. And this deep drive towards self-rule, which advertises itself so persuasively to us as freedom and independence and coming into our own, is in fact the single cruelest tyranny that a human being can ever live under. Because the self, it turns out, is a terrible and exhausting god. It is anxious, it is insatiable, it is impossible to finally satisfy, and the whole life spent serving it, feeding it, defending it, and trying in vain to please it, is a life of exhaustion beyond what most of us have the words to describe. Obedience to God is, at its heart, the daily and practical dethroning of that little tyrant. Every genuine act of obedience is a small revolution, a quiet overthrow, a personal declaration that the self is no longer the highest and final authority in this one life. And though it sounds to the unconverted ear, and to the part of us still loyal to the old regime, exactly like the loss of freedom, it is in reality the beginning of the only true freedom that has ever existed anywhere. The freedom of being ruled at last by one who is genuinely and completely good, rather than by a self that so plainly and so painfully is not. Jesus described the strange mechanism of this with words that our particular culture finds almost impossible to comprehend, words that sound like nonsense until the day they suddenly sound like the deepest wisdom you have ever heard. Whosoever will save his life shall lose it, but whosoever shall lose his life for my sake, the same shall save it. Now this is not a call to self-hatred, and it is not a call to the erasure or annihilation of the self, as some have wrongly and harmfully taken it. It is, rather, a precise description of a profound and world-inverting paradox woven into the very fabric of reality. The self, when it is clutched and grasped and endlessly served and jealously enthroned, shrinks and sours and curdles and is in the end simply lost. But the self, when it is surrendered in humble obedience to God, is found, returned to you transformed, healed, and alive in a way it never once was, back when you were its desperate and unpaid servant. You do not, in fact, lose yourself in obedience to God, whatever your fears may whisper. You lose only the tyrant version of yourself, the anxious, grasping, insecure little God you were wearing yourself out trying to serve and satisfy. And in its place, you receive back the true self you were always, from the beginning, meant to be, ruled now by a king who actually and genuinely knows how to lead you into life and delights to do it. Consider, honestly and for a moment, just how much of your own suffering across the years has flowed directly out of serving that self. The corrosive comparison that quietly steals all your joy, trace it back, and that is the self, demanding to be recognized as superior to those around it. The gnawing anxiety about the future that will not let you rest, that is the self, insisting that it must control what it was never given the power to control. The offense you cannot bring yourself to release, the grudge you keep polishing, that is the self, refusing to step down from the throne of judgment where it has installed itself. The endless aching hunger for the approval and applause of other people, that is the self, needing and craving to be worshipped by the crowd. Nearly every chronic torment of the human heart, if you follow it patiently down to its root, can be traced back to this one thing: the self on the throne, ruling badly, demanding endlessly, and satisfying nothing. And obedience to God is the steady, humble, daily work of getting up off of that throne, kneeling down before the one to whom the throne has always rightfully belonged, and discovering, to our lasting astonishment, a peace in the kneeling that the throne, for all its promises, never once gave us. This is the great secret hidden in plain sight. This is precisely why the most surrendered people you will ever meet are so consistently the most free, the most joyful, and the most deeply at rest. They have stopped, at long last, serving the exhausting and impossible God of self. They have handed the throne back over to its rightful occupant. And in that great and holy exchange, their own will traded away for his, they have received the one thing that the self, for all its striving, could never possibly provide them: rest. The rest of no longer having to be God. The rest of no longer carrying a weight they were never designed or built to carry. The rest of being, finally and simply, a beloved child living under the care of a good and wise father, rather than an anxious and overwhelmed ruler presiding over a kingdom that was always, from the very first day, far too heavy to hold. Obedience dethrones the tyrant, and the deep peace that waits on the far side of that overthrow is one of the great and best-kept secrets of the entire Christian life. Lesson 12. Obedience is love with skin. On love is not, at its core, what we feel. Love is what we do, and obedience to God is, quite simply, our love for God made visible, love that has taken on flesh and bone and action, love that has moved out of the warm and cloudy realm of private sentiment and down into the solid, costly daylight realm of deed. We live in a culture that has reduced love almost entirely down to feeling, the flutter in the chest, the warmth in the heart, the powerful emotional experience that comes and goes. And so, absorbing that reduction without even noticing, we have come to quietly imagine that we can genuinely love God, while at the same time routinely and casually disregarding what He actually asks of us, rather in the way that we might feel a warm fondness for a distant celebrity or a beloved historical figure whom we never actually serve or obey in any concrete way, because there is nothing concrete to be done. But the Scripture will not permit us this comfortable reduction, and it closes the escape hatch firmly. "This is love," wrote John, the apostle who understood the reality of love more deeply, perhaps, than any other human being who has ever lived and written, "that we walk after His commandments." Not notice that we feel warmly toward Him on Sunday mornings, that we walk after His commandments day by day through all the ordinary hours. Love, in the whole biblical vision of it, is not primarily a feeling that occasionally produces action when the feeling happens to be strong enough. It is, far more fundamentally, a way of walking, a settled direction of the whole life, a sustained and faithful obedience that may or may not happen to be accompanied by warm feeling on any given day. And this is enormously, unexpectedly liberating for anyone who has ever lain awake worrying that they must not truly love God enough, because they simply do not seem to feel enough when they try. Listen carefully, because this matters. Feelings are real, and feelings do matter. And there are precious seasons of the soul that are genuinely flooded with the felt and tangible love of God. Seasons among the very sweetest experiences a human being can ever know this side of heaven. I would never take those from you or belittle them. But feelings are also weather. They come and they go. They rise and they fall. They are affected by how well you slept, by the state of your body, by your circumstances, by 100 things that have nothing at all to do with the true condition of your soul before God. If your love for God depended from day to day on your feelings about God, then your love would be every bit as unstable and unreliable and gusting as the weather itself, blowing hot and cold with every passing front. But love that expresses itself in obedience can remain steady and constant through every single emotional season, through the bright days and the grey ones, the felt presence and the dry silence, because it does not, in the end, depend upon the feeling. It depends upon the will. And this means the astonishing thing. You can love God fully, truly and acceptably on a day when you happen to feel absolutely nothing at all, simply by continuing to walk faithfully after His commandments when all the warmth has drained away and the sky has gone grey. And here is the deeper mystery still, the thing that turns the whole matter around. The obedience very often produces the feeling rather than the feeling producing the obedience. We get it backwards. We sit and wait to feel love before we will act in love. And so often, we simply wait forever, and the feeling never comes, and nothing is ever done. But when we act in love first, when we obey God whether or not the warm emotion happens to be present in that moment, we very frequently find the feeling arriving quietly on the far side of the action, coming up behind us, in exactly the same way that deep affection for another person so often grows precisely through the faithful, unglamorous serving of them over time. The doing awakens the feeling that the waiting never could. The obedience gently opens the heart that was closed, and a love that began as nothing more than a bare, dry act of the will, offered up faithfully on a cold and empty and unfeeling day, can grow, through faithful repetition, into a warmth and a delight that a feeling's first approach would never in 1,000 years have reached. So if you have quietly doubted your love for God because of the apparent poverty of your feelings, then take real heart and let me lift the crushing pressure right off of you. You do not prove your love for God primarily by successfully feeling it. You prove it by faithfully walking it. Every single obedience, however emotionless and dry it may feel in the moment of offering it, is a genuine and precious act of love, received and treasured as exactly that by the God who reads the will underneath the deed and is not fooled by the presence or absence of accompanying emotion. So love God today, not by straining and struggling to summon up a feeling you cannot manufacture, but simply by doing the next thing He has asked of you. That is love with skin on it. That is the love He treasures most. And it is fully available to you on your very emptiest and driest day, just as completely and just as acceptably as on your fullest and most overflowing one. Lesson 13. Obedience silences the accuser. There is a certain voice that specializes entirely in accusation, and every believer without exception knows the sound of it intimately. It is the voice that recites your failures back to you in the dark. It is the voice that carefully catalogues your sins and lays them out before you. It is the voice that whispers, especially in the quiet and defenseless hours of the night, that you are a hypocrite, a fraud, a disappointment to God, a disappointment to everyone who has ever believed in you, a disappointment even to yourself. The scripture actually names the ultimate source of that voice. It calls Him the accuser of the brethren, the one who stands and accuses God's people day and night. And one of the quiet, overlooked gifts of a life of obedience is that it steadily takes away much of the accuser's raw material, leaving him with less and less to work with. To understand this gift, you have to first understand how accusation actually works, how it gets its power. Accusation, to have real force, requires evidence. The accusing voice is at its most powerful, its most piercing and wounding, precisely when it can point to a genuine, real, undeniable contradiction between what you claim to be and how you actually live. When it can say, with the terrible ring of truth, you call yourself a follower of Christ, and yet look at what you did yesterday. Look at what you are hiding right now. Look at the wide gap between your fine words and your actual ways. And when there truly is such a gap, a real and glaring inconsistency between the confession and the conduct, then the accusation has teeth, sharp ones, because it is at least partly true, and it is the partial truth wrapped inside it that gives it the terrible power to wound so deeply. A pure and total lie is relatively easy to recognize and dismiss. It is the lie carefully wrapped around a hard kernel of genuine fact that slips past our defenses and pierces us to the heart. Now, obedience does not make you sinless, and let us be completely clear and honest about that, because a false hope helps no one. Obedience does not silence the accuser by finally making you flawless and perfect and beyond all reproach. That day does not come in this life, but steady, growing obedience does something real and significant. It closes the gaps. It steadily reduces the glaring contradictions between your confession and your conduct. And a life of growing, deepening obedience gives the accuser progressively less and less to work with over time, simply because there is progressively less and less of the obvious, glaring hypocrisy that accusation feeds upon and needs in order to thrive. When your life increasingly and visibly matches your professed faith, not perfectly but genuinely, and more so year by year, then the voice that hisses that you are nothing but a fraud finds fewer and fewer actual facts on which to build its case. It still speaks, of course. It will always speak right to the end. But its words land with less and less force, glance off more and more easily, because they are increasingly contradicted by the plain, visible shape of a life that is being brought, day by day, into real alignment with its Lord. But there is a deeper silencing still, and this is the most important thing of all to understand here, so do not miss it, because obedience alone is not, and never can be, the final and ultimate answer to accusation. The final answer, The deepest silencing is the cross of Jesus Christ. When the accuser recites your real and genuine and utterly undeniable failures, and there will always in this life be real ones to recite, because our obedience is never yet perfect and complete. The mature believer does not answer that accusation by pointing to their own impressive record of obedience, as if to say, "But look how good I have been, look how much I have improved, surely that outweighs it." No, that is a losing game and a proud one, and it will crush you every time. The believer answers the accusation instead by pointing to the blood of Christ, which has already fully and finally paid for every single failure that the accuser could ever possibly name, past, present, and future. There is therefore now no condemnation to them which are in Christ Jesus. There it is. That is the final and total silencing, the word against which no accusation can stand. Obedience closes the gaps that give accusation its foothold and its evidence, yes, and that is a real and valuable thing. But when accusation somehow finds a foothold anyway, as it sometimes still will even in the most faithful life, the answer is never a better and more impressive performance. The answer is always a finished and sufficient cross. So, obedience and grace work together here, hand in hand, exactly as they always do everywhere in the Christian life, never in opposition. Obedience takes away much of the accuser's ammunition, quietly and over time, by bringing your life into growing alignment with your faith so that the old contradictions shrink. And grace takes away all the rest of it, absolutely and at once, by covering completely every failure that still remains. And between the two of them, working together, the accusing voice is left in the end, holding nothing at all that can finally condemn you. You can stand, cleansed entirely by grace and increasingly aligned by obedience, and simply let the accusation break against you and shatter harmlessly, like a wave breaking against an immovable rock. Obedience is part of how you learn to stand there, unmoved in the roar of it, and the rock you are standing on, the rock that does not move, is Christ Himself. Lesson 14. Obedience makes you a blessing to others. Your obedience is never, ever only about you. This is one of the most consistently overlooked dimensions of the entire subject, and grasping it lifts obedience clean out of the narrow realm of private spiritual self-improvement and sets it down in something vastly larger and more beautiful. When you obey God, other people who did not make the choice, people who often will never even know the choice was made, are quietly blessed by an obedience they themselves never offered. Your yes to God becomes, without your always seeing how, a real and tangible gift poured out on the lives of people who had nothing at all to do with the choosing of it. Consider just how this works, in the most ordinary and everyday of ways, all around us and all the time. The parent who obeys God in the hard and daily discipline of patience gives their children a childhood that is free from a rage that would otherwise have scarred and marked them for the rest of their lives. The children did not earn that peace, and they will likely never know what they were spared. They simply received it as the quiet fruit of an obedience that their mother or their father offered up, often at real and hidden internal cost, on the many days when patience was truly the very last thing they felt like giving. The person who obeys God in the matter of honesty becomes over time someone whom others can safely build their lives upon. A spouse who can be trusted with the heart, a friend who can be relied upon in the crisis, a colleague whose plain word actually means something solid in a world where words have grown cheap and slippery. The one who obeys God in generosity meets real needs whose full extent they will never see or know, becoming, without ever hearing of it, the answer to prayers they never heard, prayed by people they never met. Obedience ripples outward, always in every direction, blessing whole circles of people who stand far beyond the one who first obeyed. The scripture is emphatic that no one among us lives or dies to himself alone. We are bound up together, our individual lives woven tightly into one another's in 10,000 ways we cannot fully see or trace. And this profound interconnection means that both our obedience and our disobedience carry a reach that extends far, far past ourselves. The disobedience of a single person can wound an entire family for generations. And we have all seen this happen, have we not? Watched the pain travel down a bloodline, watched the wound get passed from parent to child to grandchild, handed down like a grim inheritance until at last someone somewhere in the line finally obeys God enough, at enough personal cost, to break the chain and stop the passing on. And in exactly the same way, running in exactly the opposite direction, the obedience of a single person can bless an entire family for generations, becoming a hidden fountain of good that goes on flowing to people not yet even born, who will one day drink freely and gratefully from it, without ever once knowing whose costly, hidden obedience first dug the well from which they drink. This truth should completely change how you think about the obediences that no one else will ever see. You may quietly believe that your private faithfulness matters in the end only to you, that your solitary yes to God in some hidden and unwitnessed struggle is a small, self-contained thing, sealed off, affecting no one but yourself. But it is not so. It is simply not so. That hidden obedience is, at this very moment, sending ripples out into rooms that you yourself will never enter, into futures you will never live to see, into the lives of people who will one day be quietly and truly blessed by a choice they never knew you made in the dark. The husband who quietly conquers a private temptation is, in that unseen moment, protecting a wife who will never even know the danger she was spared. The young person who holds fast to their integrity in a single unwitnessed moment of pressure is preserving a future family, not yet begun, from a wound that would otherwise have traveled down through them for generations. Your obedience is a stone dropped into a still pond, and the ripples of it spread outward, silently and steadily, until they reach the far shore that you cannot see from where you stand. So the next time obedience is genuinely costly, and you find yourself tempted to think that it does not really matter because no one will ever know about it anyway, remember this and let it steady you. Someone will be blessed by this. Perhaps someone you love and can see. Perhaps someone not yet born whom you will never meet. Perhaps a complete stranger, far downstream in the long current of consequence that you are right now, in this hidden moment, quietly setting in motion for good. Your obedience is never only about you. It is one of the primary ways that God has chosen to bless a whole world, through the quiet, costly faithfulness of ordinary people who are willing to say yes to Him, even in the dark, even when no one is watching, even when it seems to matter to no one but Him. Lesson 15. Obedience requires and builds courage. We are exactly halfway through our 30 lessons now, and I want to stop and name something plainly and honestly, because we do the whole subject a real disservice if we do not. Obedience is very often frightening. We speak of it too easily sometimes, as though it were always gentle and always easy, a simple and painless matter of quiet compliance. But that is not the truth of it. There are obediences that require enormous courage, obediences that ask us to do the very thing we are most deeply afraid to do, that call us to step directly into a fear rather than safely away from it. And one of the great and largely unadvertised things that obedience does in us, over time and with repetition, is that it builds within us a courage we never knew we were capable of possessing. Fear is the great and constant enemy of obedience. Behind most of our disobedience, if we are willing to trace it honestly all the way down to its actual root, we find not proud rebellion, but simple fear. We do not obey God in the hard and necessary conversation because we are afraid of the conflict it will bring. We do not obey Him in the act of generosity because we are afraid of the lack it might leave us in. We do not obey him in the step of faith he is asking for, because we are afraid of the failure, the embarrassment, the loss, the looking foolish. Fear leans in close and whispers always that obedience is simply too dangerous this time, that the cost is too high, that in this one particular case, given these unique circumstances, the wise and prudent and safe thing is surely to hold back, to wait, to protect ourselves. And courage, real courage, is precisely and exactly the willingness to obey anyway, with the fear still fully present, still speaking, still absolutely real and unresolved. This is worth understanding very clearly because a great many people wait and wait and wait to somehow feel unafraid before they will obey. And that day, that feeling, simply never arrives, and so they never move. So hear this plainly. Courage is not the absence of fear. It never was. Courage is obedience in the very presence of fear. Consider that the single command God gives more frequently than any other command in all of Scripture, more than the command to worship, more even than the command to love, is, in its many forms, the command, fear not. Do not be afraid. And he speaks it again and again, precisely to people who had every earthly and rational reason to be terrified, people who were being called to obey him in spite of their fear, not after it had conveniently gone away. God does not, as a rule, remove the fear first and then ask for the obedience once we feel safe. He asks for the obedience while the fear is still there and the courage is forged, hot and real, in the very act of the doing. And here is the thing that those who have never once tried it simply cannot know, the secret that only the obedient discover. Courage grows in exactly the same way that a muscle grows, through use against real resistance. Over time, the very first frightening obedience is always the hardest of all, because you have no history behind you, no accumulated evidence, nothing at all to stand on except the raw and howling fear and the bare, unadorned command. But when you obey through the fear that first time, and then discover, on the far side of the obedience, that God was faithful after all, that the catastrophe you so vividly dreaded either did not come at all or was not remotely as terrible as your fear had painted it, that his presence rose up to meet you in the very place you were most afraid to go. Then you have laid down, in your own soul, a single solid stone of evidence, and the next frightening obedience, when it comes, is offered up standing on that stone, and the one after that stands on two. Over the long course of a whole life of obeying through fear, a person quietly accumulates such a broad and solid foundation of these evidence stones that they become by slow degrees genuinely and durably courageous, not because the fear has finally vanished and left them alone, but because it simply no longer gets the final word in the matter. It speaks, and they act anyway because they have too much evidence now to be ruled by it. So do not wait, and do not keep waiting to stop being afraid before you obey. That is not the deal that God is offering you, and waiting for it will cost you your whole life. The deal he is actually offering is this, that he will meet you in the obedience itself, that his presence will be most real and most near precisely there, where the fear is sharpest and the ground feels least secure, and that in obeying through fear again and again, you will slowly discover a courage that could be forged in no other furnace on earth. The fear you feel is not a sign that you should not obey. Very often, in fact, the fear is a sign that you are standing at the exact threshold of the one obedience that will change you the most, transform you the deepest. So step through it. Do not turn back. He's already there, waiting for you on the other side. Lesson 16. Obedience teaches you who God really is. You do not learn the true character of God from a safe distance, studying him like a subject in a textbook. You learn it out in the field, in the doing, in the concrete and specific experience of actually obeying him, and then watching with your own eyes how he responds. Every single act of obedience is, among all the other things it is, a kind of experiment in the faithfulness of God, a real test, whether you ever consciously intend it as one or not, run directly upon the reliability of His character. And the accumulated results of that experiment, gathered patiently over years and decades, teach you who God really is, in a way that no book of theology, however excellent and true, ever possibly could. When you obey God in a genuine act of costly generosity, and then watch, over the following weeks, as He faithfully provides for you in some way you did not expect, you have learned something real about His faithfulness that you now actually know in your bones, rather than merely believe on someone else's word. When you obey Him in the hard work of forgiveness, releasing a wrong you had every right to hold, and then discover the strange and unexpected freedom that comes flooding into the very space where the bitter resentment used to live and fester, you have learned something real about His wisdom, about the profound truth that His hardest and most counterintuitive commands are always secretly for our own deep liberation. When you obey Him by stepping out into a frightening unknown, and then find, upon arriving, that He was already standing there waiting for you before you came, you have learned something about His faithful presence that will quietly steady you and hold you upright for the rest of your life. Obedience is the very means by which the great attributes of God move down off of the printed page and into your own personal, first-hand experience. From abstract theory into living testimony, from something you were once told by others into something you now know for yourself because you were there. This precisely is why the God of the mature and seasoned believer is so much larger, so much warmer, so much more real and solid and near than the God of the raw beginner, even in the many cases where the two of them would affirm, on paper, the very same doctrines and hold the very same theology word for word. The mature believer has obeyed God through 1,000 different situations and watched Him prove faithful in every single one of them, and so their knowledge of God is no longer merely a tidy set of true propositions held in the mind. It has become instead a rich treasury of memories, a deeply personal history of His proven reliability, a great collection of specific times that He came through when everything was on the line, a kind of scar tissue certainty that this God can be trusted absolutely because He has been tested hard and found faithful and true again and again and again. The beginner believes sincerely and truly that God is faithful. The veteran of 1,000 obediences knows it in the same settled, unanxious way that you know the load-bearing wall of your own house will hold, because you have leaned the full weight of your life against it in 100 different storms, and not once, not even once, has it ever given way beneath you. And this points in the end to something genuinely tender and moving about why God so often asks for our obedience specifically in the hard things, the costly things, the frightening things. It is not because He Himself needs the test or is uncertain of the outcome. He knows His own faithfulness perfectly and completely. He does not need to prove it to Himself. No, the test is entirely for you. Every hard obedience He asks of you is, underneath the difficulty, an invitation to add yet another solid piece of evidence to your ever-growing personal knowledge of exactly who He is. Another vivid memory of His reliability to reach for and draw upon in the next dark night when you will need it. Another brick laid into the deep foundation of a trust that will one day be strong enough and broad enough to hold you steady through absolutely anything that life can bring against you. God is building through all your obediences, great and small, a personal and experiential knowledge of Himself inside of you that could be built in no other way on earth. Because some things about God, the deepest and most precious things, simply cannot be learned except by obeying Him and then watching in wonder what He does. So the very next time obedience is required of you in something genuinely difficult, you might try to reframe it quietly in your own mind. This is not merely a hard command to be gritted through and endured. It is an invitation to discover firsthand and for yourself yet another dimension of the faithfulness of God, to run the great experiment one more time, and to add its result to your growing treasury of holy evidence. So obey and then watch closely. And let what you see with your own eyes become part of the deepening, ever-enlarging, unshakable, experiential knowledge of the God who has never once, not one single time in all of history, failed those who trusted him enough to do what he said. Lesson 17. Obedience aligns you with the grain of reality. God's commands are not arbitrary. This is one of the single most important things you can ever come to understand about the whole subject of obedience, and grasping it dissolves an astonishing amount of the resistance we instinctively feel toward the commands themselves. The commands of God are not a random set of rules imposed upon us by divine whim, arbitrary tests of our loyalty with no real connection to how anything actually works. They are, rather, accurate descriptions of how life itself actually functions, given to us by the very one who designed and built that life from the ground up. To obey them, therefore, is to move with the grain of the universe, and to disobey them is to move against that grain and to suffer sooner or later and inevitably the splinters. Think of a master craftsman who has built something of extraordinary complexity, precision, and beauty, and who then hands you, along with it, a manual of instructions, not in order to restrict you or spoil your enjoyment, but simply because he knows exactly how the thing works, and you, standing there holding it for the first time, do not. The instructions in that manual are not arbitrary restrictions dreamed up to limit your freedom. They are the distilled, hard-won wisdom of the designer himself, telling you plainly how to operate what he made in the specific way that will bring the very best out of it and keep it from breaking down. To ignore that manual is not brave, independent-minded self-expression. It is a nearly guaranteed way to damage something precious and irreplaceable through simple ignorance of how it was actually meant to run. And the commands of God are exactly this. They are the Maker's own instructions for the operation of a human life, given to us by the one who designed and formed the human soul, and who therefore knows with perfect and complete knowledge exactly how it flourishes and exactly how and why it breaks. When God commands honesty, then, he is not simply imposing upon us an arbitrary divine preference for truth-telling over lying, as if he could just as easily have preferred the reverse. He is describing the only possible foundation upon which trust, and therefore all genuine human relationship, all society, all love, can actually be built and sustained. When he commands us against the specific things that corrode and rot the human heart, he is not being restrictive merely for the sake of restriction, flexing his authority. He is warning us away, as a loving parent warns a child, from the exact behaviors that will, by the very unchangeable design of reality itself, hollow us out from the inside and enslave us. And when he commands love, forgiveness, generosity, and faithfulness, he is not handing us a burdensome and joyless list of religious duties to grimly perform. He is telling us the actual shape of the life that genuinely works, the life the human soul was specifically built and designed for, the life that leads in the end to the deep flourishing we were all made to experience and long for without even knowing its name. This means that disobedience is never ever merely the breaking of a rule, the way one might break an arbitrary company policy. It is something far more serious and far more inescapable. It is the grinding of your one precious life directly against the grain of reality itself. And reality, always and without exception, wins that contest. You can, if you insist, defy the law of gravity by stepping off the edge of a cliff, but you do not thereby break the law or escape it or prove it wrong. You merely demonstrate it vividly all the way down. And in exactly the same way, you can defy the deep moral and spiritual laws that God has woven into the very fabric of His creation. But you do not thereby escape them either. You simply collide with them, and the collision is the thing that we call consequence. The person who lives in ongoing disobedience is not, as they often imagine, cleverly getting away with something. They are slowly discovering, the hard and painful way over time, that the commands they scorned and dismissed were in fact accurate descriptions of the way things truly and unchangeably are. So obedience, seen rightly and clearly at last, is not the cramping and constraining of your life. It is the aligning of it, the bringing of your one short and precious and unrepeatable life into deep harmony with the underlying structure of reality itself, so that you finally stop exhausting yourself fighting hopelessly against the current and start instead being carried gladly along by it. And there is a profound rest in this, a deep and settling rightness, the long exhale of a life that has at last stopped straining against the way things actually are and started flowing freely with them. Obedience is coming home to reality. It is finally, at long last, living in the way that you were actually built and designed to live. And everything in you that was made and designed by God, which is to say quite simply everything in you, begins in that alignment to work at last the way it was always meant to work. Lesson 18. Obedience is sustained by grace, not willpower. If you have heard everything we have said so far across these 17 lessons and felt, somewhere underneath it all, a rising weight, a growing pressure, a quiet and creeping despair that says, "I could never actually obey like this. My willpower is simply not strong enough. I have tried before and failed again and again, too many times to count." Then this 18th lesson is the one that your heart most desperately needs to hear, and I want to speak it slowly and clearly and with great care. The obedience that God calls you to is not, in the end, fueled by your willpower. It is fueled by His grace. And the entire Christian life falls apart, collapses into exhaustion and despair the very moment we forget this one crucial truth. Here is the great and common error that has quietly crushed so many sincere and earnest believers, perhaps including you. They hear the clear call to obey, and so they grit their teeth, and they summon up all their willpower, and they make firm and solemn resolutions to finally do better this time. And for a little while, sometimes they actually manage it, straining hard under their own steam and effort. And then, inevitably, the willpower runs out, as willpower always does eventually, because it is a finite and quickly depleted resource, and they collapse right back down into the very same old patterns they swore they had left behind. And the collapse breeds a bitter shame, and the shame breeds a deeper despair, and eventually, after enough of these cycles, they conclude, quietly and with great sadness, that they simply are not capable of living the obedient life, that it must be for other people, stronger people, and they give up trying altogether. And the real tragedy in all of it, the thing that breaks the heart, is that they were never once meant to obey by willpower in the first place. They were trying the whole time to run the Christian life on an engine it was never designed to run on, and no amount of grim determination could make that engine turn over for long. The New Testament is absolutely emphatic and utterly relentless on this single point, and it is a point that changes everything once it finally lands. It is God which worketh in you both to will and to do of His good pleasure. Read that sentence again slowly, and let each word of it register. God works in you not only the doing, but the willing, not only the power to obey, but the very desire to obey in the first place. The obedience that truly pleases God is not, and never was, the white-knuckled, teeth-gritted effort of a person straining to be good in their own limited strength. It is, rather, the natural overflow of a life that is being genuinely changed from the inside out by grace, a life in which God Himself is quietly producing both the wanting and the doing, both the desire and the deed. Your part in all of this is not to somehow manufacture obedience out of nothing by sheer force of will. Your part is to stay connected to the source, to abide, to remain in the vine as a branch remains, and simply to let the obedience grow up out of you the way that fruit grows on a healthy branch, naturally, quietly, from the life flowing steadily in, rather than by the branch grunting and straining and struggling to somehow produce apples through its own desperate determination. And this one truth changes absolutely everything about how you go about pursuing the obedient life. You stop asking, first and always, how can I try harder? How can I grit my teeth and summon more effort? And you start asking instead, how can I stay more deeply connected to the grace that alone produces this fruit in me? How can I abide more closely? You stop treating obedience as a performance that you must generate from your own depleted resources, and you start treating it as a fruit that you cultivate simply by remaining rooted in rich soil. And when you fail, because you will still fail at times, even living this way, you no longer spiral down into crushing shame and then redouble your grim and exhausting effort. Instead, you simply return, again, to the source. You receive the grace, freely, once more. You let the life flow back in through the reconnected branch, and you find, over time, to your genuine surprise, that an obedience which your own willpower could never once sustain for long begins to grow up in you almost naturally, almost easily, out of a life that is simply being kept close, day by day, to God Himself. So take the crushing, impossible weight off of your own shoulders, right now, today. You were never once meant to carry it there in the first place. The obedience that God asks of you is the very same obedience that God Himself supplies the power for. Your one job, your only real job, is to stay near enough to Him to keep receiving that power through prayer, through His Word, through humble dependence, through the daily, moment-by-moment returning to the grace that never, ever runs dry, the way your willpower always and inevitably does. So do not try harder in your own strength. That road only ever ends in exhaustion. Instead, draw nearer, nearer to the strength that is not your own and never runs out. That is the great secret that the exhausted, striving, defeated, ready-to-give-up believer most needs to hear and to believe. The obedience is real, and it is genuinely required, and it is also entirely and gloriously possible, not because you are strong, but because He is, and because He has promised, faithfully, to work it in you Himself. Lesson 19. Obedience frees you from the exhaustion of deciding. There is a hidden and unadvertised exhaustion buried deep within the disobedient life that no one ever warns you about beforehand, and it is the sheer, grinding exhaustion of endless negotiation. When you have not yet actually settled once and for all the fundamental question of obedience, when it remains perpetually open, perpetually up for debate, then every single command of God becomes a fresh argument, a whole new round of internal bargaining, a fresh occasion for that draining and interminable committee meeting inside your own head, in which your desires and your conscience and your rationalizations and your fears all argue with one another, loudly, late into the night. And this constant, wearying relitigating of matters you already know perfectly well to be right is quietly one of the most tiring and depleting ways that a human being can possibly live. Consider, honestly, just how much precious energy is silently consumed by a heart that has not yet settled the question of obedience. Every temptation that comes along becomes a lengthy and draining internal trial, complete with prosecution and defense and endless deliberation. Every clear and unambiguous instruction of Scripture becomes something to be argued with, to find clever exceptions to explain away and negotiate around. The mind spins and spins and spins some more, constructing elaborate justifications, carefully weighing the odds of getting away with this or that, calculating and then recalculating the costs and benefits. And all of this churning, grinding mental machinery runs constantly just beneath the surface of an ordinary day, quietly draining the person of a deep vitality that they cannot even account for the loss of. They only know that they are tired, always tired, and they do not know why. The disobedient life is simply not the free, light, carefree life that it so relentlessly advertises itself to be. It is, in reality, an exhausting life, and it is exhausting precisely because nothing in it is ever finally settled, and so everything endlessly must be decided all over again. But there is a strange and wonderful and almost unbelievable freedom waiting on the far side of settled obedience, and few people ever taste it because few people ever get there. When you have genuinely resolved the matter all the way down in the very core of your will, when you have truly decided once and deeply that you will simply do what God says, when obedience has finally moved from being a case-by-case, exhausting individual negotiation and become instead a settled, standing disposition of the whole heart, then an absolutely enormous amount of energy is suddenly and permanently freed up within you. The debates simply end. The exhausting internal committee is at last dismissed and sent home. When a command of God is clear, you simply obey it. In the very same effortless way that you simply stop your car at a red light without first convening a lengthy philosophical inquiry into the nature and legitimacy of traffic law every single time you happen to approach an intersection. The matter was settled long ago in advance, and because it is settled, it no longer costs you anything to keep. And the settling of it is a profound and ongoing relief. You are simply no longer exhausting yourself day after day in the pointless redeciding of things that ought, by all rights, to have been decided once and for all a long time ago. This is a real and important part of what the Scripture means when it speaks so often of the deep peace that obedience brings into a life, and it turns out to have a very practical and even psychological shape to it. A divided heart is, always and necessarily, an exhausted heart, a heart that wants, at one and the same time, both to obey and to disobey. A heart that has never actually resolved the fundamental question of who, in the end, is truly in charge of this life. Lives in a perpetual, grinding, low-grade state of internal civil war that slowly wears it down day by day, far beneath the level of its own conscious awareness. But a heart that has genuinely settled the great question, a heart that has knelt once and deeply and truly, and said from the bottom of itself, "Not my will, but thine be done." That heart is, at last, a heart at rest, freed from the exhausting war, no longer torn violently in two opposite directions at once, finally able to spend on love and on creativity and on joy and on other people all the vast reserves of energy that it used to burn up uselessly every single day on nothing but internal argument and negotiation. So one of the quiet and unexpected gifts that obedience offers you is simply this: the priceless gift of a settled soul. Decide the one big question once, deeply, in the core of who you are, and then be freed gloriously from having to decide it 100 exhausting times a day for the rest of your life. Let obedience become, in you, not an endless series of agonized and draining individual choices, but a single, settled direction of the entire life. And then discover for yourself just how much lighter and how much freer and how much more restful your days become once you are no longer perpetually negotiating with God over matters that He, in His wisdom and love, settled rightly long ago. The obedient heart is, in the end, the restful heart, not because it never once faces temptation, But because it has stopped holding a full and exhausting trial every single time, temptation comes knocking at the door. It already knows the verdict. It settled it long ago. And in that quiet knowing, it finds an astonishing and unexpected measure of peace. Lesson 20. Obedience is the path Jesus himself walked. We come now to the very center of the whole matter, the place toward which all of this has quietly been leading us from the very beginning, and I want you to slow down and truly feel the full weight of it. The obedience that God calls you to is not something that He asks of you from a safe and comfortable distance, having never once done it Himself, issuing commands from on high that cost Him nothing. No. It is the exact same path that Jesus Christ, the eternal Son of God, walked before you, and for you, a path of obedience so complete, so total, so unimaginably costly that everything we have said across all these lessons finds its final meaning and its actual power entirely in Him. The Scripture makes a truly astonishing statement about Jesus, one that we can too easily read right past without letting it stop our breath. Though He were a son, yet learned He obedience by the things which He suffered. Learned obedience. Let that sink in. The eternal Son of God, in taking on our human flesh and entering fully into our human condition, actually walked the human road of learning to obey, not because He was ever, for one instant, rebellious or resistant, for He never sinned, not once, in thought or word or deed, but because He entered so fully and so completely into the real human experience that He knew from the inside what it actually costs a human being to choose to do the Father's will in the very teeth of everything that makes it hard and painful and frightening. He knew that cost from the inside. He knew it in a garden called Gethsemane, on His knees in the dark, alone, sweating as it were great drops of blood falling down to the ground, facing a cup of suffering that He genuinely, in His true humanity, did not want to drink. And there, at the very deepest point of human anguish that has ever been reached, He prayed the prayer that is the beating heart of all obedience everywhere, for all time. Not my will, but thine, be done. Let the full reality of this land on you and settle into you. Everything that we have explored together across these 20 lessons so far, obedience as trust, obedience as love, obedience as worship, obedience as the dethroning of the tyrant self, all of it was accomplished perfectly and completely, once and for all, by Jesus. He trusted the Father all the way down into death itself. He loved the Father all the way up onto a cross. He dethroned every last natural impulse of self-preservation in what was, without any competition, the single greatest act of obedience in the entire history of the universe, obeying, as the Scripture says, unto death, even the death of the cross. And He did all of this not merely as our shining example to be admired and imitated from afar, though He is that, but as our substitute, standing in our place. He obeyed perfectly precisely where we have failed, offering up to the Father the flawless, spotless, complete obedience that we ourselves could never once have offered, so that His perfect record of obedience could be freely credited to our deeply imperfect account. The obedience of Jesus is therefore not only the pattern that we follow, it is the very ground that we stand upon. It is both. And this transforms our own obedience utterly from a lonely and anxious striving into a following in the very footsteps of one who has already walked the entire road ahead of us, every step of it, all the way to the end. When you face your own Gethsemane, your own dark garden, whatever and wherever it is, where obedience means the real surrender of something you desperately want to keep and hold on to, you do not face it alone. And you do not face it as one attempting something that has never been done before, some untested and terrifying frontier. You face it walking directly behind a Savior who once knelt in that very same kind of darkness, who felt that very same dread pressing down on his soul, who prayed that very same aching prayer of surrender, and who then came through it out the other side into a resurrection that proves for all time and beyond all doubt that obedience is never, ever the end of the story. His own "not my will but thine" led him straight through a real cross and into a real and empty tomb. And yours, joined to his by faith, leads by that same road to that same place. So when obedience costs you everything you have, look to him. Not to a distant and untouched deity issuing cold commands from the perfect safety and comfort of a far-off heaven, but to a Savior with real scars still in his hands and his feet. One who walked the whole hard road of costly obedience all the way to its bitter, bloody end, and then out the other side of it into glory and life. He is not asking you to go anywhere at all that he has not already been himself first ahead of you. He's asking you only to follow him down a road that he has already walked, already conquered, already soaked with his own blood, and already lit up at its far end with the light of his own resurrection. The path of obedience is the very path that Jesus himself walked. And to walk it now is to walk with him and behind him and finally in him, moving step by step toward the very same resurrection that waited for him on the far side of his own great and world-saving yes. Lesson 21. Obedience turns suffering into something redemptive. Suffering comes sooner or later to every single life, to the obedient and the disobedient alike, falling like rain on the just and the unjust. No one is exempt, and no amount of faithfulness buys a pass. But there is a profound and world-altering difference in what that suffering finally becomes, depending entirely on whether it is met with obedience or met with rebellion. In the hands of an obedient heart, even suffering, meaningless-seeming, cruel, undeserved suffering, is somehow transformed into something that produces, that builds, that yields a harvest no one watching would ever have believed possible. Obedience is the strange alchemy that turns raw pain into pure gold. The disobedient response to suffering is, understandably, to demand loudly that it stop at once, to rage against the God who allowed it to come, to conclude bitterly that the pain itself proves either his total absence or his secret cruelty, and then to use the suffering as a justification for abandoning the whole path of faith altogether. And suffering, met in this way, simply damages, and nothing more. It hardens the heart into stone. It embitters the spirit. It leaves a person smaller and colder and more tightly closed than they were before it came. Nothing at all is redeemed by it. The pain is pure and total loss. But the obedient response to suffering, which is not, let me be very clear, a denial of the pain, not a grim pretending that it does not really hurt, but rather a continuing to trust and to obey God in the very teeth and midst of it. While it still hurts terribly, that response opens a door. It opens the door for that very same suffering to become, in time, the single most fruitful and transforming season of an entire life. The scripture is completely unembarrassed and unflinching about this, and it is worth hearing plainly and slowly. Tribulation worketh patience, and patience experience, and experience hope. There is a chain described there, a definite sequence, a real process, a process by which suffering, when it is met with obedient trust rather than rebellion, actually produces something precious and enduring that could be produced in absolutely no other way and by no other means. The patience, the tested and proven character, the durable and unshakable hope that no circumstance can steal, these priceless things are simply not manufactured in the easy seasons of comfort and abundance. They cannot be. They are forged and only forged in tribulation, in the specific searing crucible of pain endured while still somehow holding fast to God with both hands. The person who obeys God through their suffering comes out the other side of it possessing a depth, a hard-won compassion, an unbreakable strength, and a settled hope that the person who never suffered at all, or who suffered without obedience and let it make them bitter, simply does not and cannot possess. Now, this does not mean, and I want to say this very carefully, that we are called to pretend that suffering is somehow good in itself, or that we should stand and thank God for evil, as though evil were a gift wrapped in bright paper. The Scripture never once asks us to call darkness light, or to smile numbly at what is truly terrible. It does not ask you to be grateful for the cancer, or the betrayal, or the grave. What it promises instead is something far more subtle and far more powerful and far more trustworthy than that. It promises that God is fully able to work even the very darkest suffering into genuine good for those who love Him and who continue, right through the thickest of the darkness, to trust and to obey Him. The obedience does not make the suffering itself good. It makes the suffering fruitful. It takes the raw and terrible material of the pain and hands it over to God, the same God who brought the single greatest good in all of history, the salvation of the world, out of the single greatest evil in all of history, the murder of His own Son, the God who brought resurrection and everlasting life directly out of a bloody Roman cross. And He takes that handed-over pain, and He works from it a harvest that redeems what would otherwise have been nothing but pure, wasted loss. So if you are suffering even now, as you listen to this, and some of you are deeply, in ways no one around you fully sees, and the great temptation pressing on you is to conclude that God has failed you, and that the whole path of obedience is simply not worth walking anymore, then I want to gently offer you a completely different possibility to hold on to. This suffering, when it is met with continued trust and obedience, is not the end of your story, and it is not being wasted. Not one tear of it. In the hands of the God you are choosing to keep obeying even here, it is becoming something. The tears are all being counted and kept. The endurance is quietly building something deep and strong within you that ease and comfort never could have built. And on the far side of it, as countless obedient sufferers have discovered again and again throughout all the long history of the faith and have testified with their own mouths, you may well find that the very pain you begged God with all your strength to simply remove became instead the unexpected doorway into the deepest, richest, and most fruitful season of your entire life. Obedience is the thing that keeps that door standing open. So keep obeying, even here, especially here. Do not stop now. Lesson 22. Obedience guards your freedom. We have been carefully taught by nearly every voice in our culture to see obedience and freedom as sworn opposites, as though every single step we take toward obeying God were necessarily a step away from being truly free. This is perhaps the single greatest and most destructive lie that our whole culture tells about this entire subject, and I want to expose it now for exactly what it is, because it is precisely, completely, dangerously backwards. Obedience does not diminish your freedom. Obedience is how you guard and keep it. And the disobedient life, which markets itself so loudly and so relentlessly as the free life, the liberated life, is in fact the surest and most reliable road there is into the very deepest kind of slavery a human being can know. Jesus said it with total, unflinching clarity, leaving no room for confusion. Whosoever committeth sin is the servant of sin. The one who indulges the forbidden thing imagines in the moment that they are boldly exercising their freedom, doing exactly what they want, throwing off all restraint, living authentically at last. But watch carefully what actually happens over time, again and again, in life after life. The thing that they freely chose slowly begins to choose them. The indulgence repeated gradually becomes a habit. The habit fed becomes a compulsion. The compulsion entrenched becomes a chain. And the person who began by so freely and proudly choosing the thing ends, at last, unable to stop it even when they desperately, tearfully want to, even when it is destroying everything they love. What began as a bright exercise of freedom has become, by imperceptible degrees, a dark prison, and the door of that prison is locked tragically from the inside. This is the universal testimony of every addiction that has ever ruined a life, every bondage, every destructive pattern that began as an innocent-seeming free choice and ended as a cruel and absolute master. Sin always enslaves in the end what it first merely seduced, and obedience precisely by refusing the very thing that would have enslaved us is what keeps a person genuinely free. Every single act of obedience is a refusal to hand over your own freedom to something that, once it has it, will never willingly give it back. When you obey God's clear no to the thing that would, in time, become your master and your ruin, you are not losing your freedom in that moment, whatever it may feel like. You are guarding it. You are keeping it safe. You are actively preserving your own precious capacity to choose by refusing to surrender that capacity to a habit that would steal it from you and never return it. The obedient person remains free in the very deepest and truest sense of the word. Free to love, free to choose the good, free from the grinding tyranny of the compulsions that secretly rule the disobedient from the inside out. They have kept their liberty intact by the very obedience that looked from the outside and to the untrained eye exactly like a limitation and a loss of it. This is precisely why the commands of God so consistently forbid the specific things that enslave. God is not restricting your freedom for the cruel fun of restriction or because he begrudges you your pleasure and wants you miserable. He is protecting your freedom from the very things that, once you admit them and give them a foothold, do not remain content to stay as quiet guests, but always, eventually, and without exception, seize the whole house and make you their servant. The command against the destructive indulgence is not God grudgingly withholding a good and innocent pleasure from you out of stinginess. It is God standing guard at a door, placing himself deliberately between you and a slavery that dresses itself up so convincingly as a good time, and that reveals its true and terrible nature only later, only after the chains have already been quietly and firmly fastened. The person who obeys is the person who stays free, and the person who disobeys, all the while congratulating himself on his brave liberation and his throwing off of restraint, is so very often the very person who is walking step by chosen step, smiling as he goes, straight into a cage. So reject this lie completely and finally, and do not let it back in. Obedience is not the enemy of your freedom, it is the faithful guardian of it. The freest people who have ever walked this earth were not in fact those who threw off every restraint and did whatever they pleased. Those people so often ended in the deepest bondage of all. The freest were those who obeyed God deeply and consistently enough to remain genuinely unenslaved by the very things that quietly master everyone else. So guard your freedom, guard it fiercely by obeying the one who actually wants you free and made you to be free and gave everything to set you free. And do not for anything sell your precious liberty cheaply to any pleasure that promises you freedom and delivers always and only and inevitably a subtler and more terrible bondage than the one you thought you were escaping. Lesson 23. Obedience makes your life a testimony. There is a kind of preaching that requires no words at all, and it is very often the single most powerful kind of preaching there is. When a person obeys God consistently, faithfully, over a long period of time, and especially when they do so through the kinds of hard circumstances that would break most people and send them running, their very life itself becomes an argument for the reality of God that no spoken sermon, however eloquent, could ever match or replace. Obedience preaches. A life that is lived in faithful, visible obedience is a testimony that reaches deep into people who would never once open a Bible or set foot inside a church. precisely because they cannot argue with the living evidence standing right there in front of them, walking around in their own family, their own workplace, their own street. The world is absolutely full of people who have already decided and closed the case in their minds that faith is empty, that God is a comforting fiction, that religion is nothing but a crutch for the weak and a con for the credulous. Arguments, however clever and well-constructed, rarely move such people even an inch, because they have already heard the arguments, all of them, and have carefully armored themselves against everyone. But a life is a different thing entirely. A life gets past the armor. When such a hardened person encounters, up close and over time, a human being whose obedience to God has produced something in them that simply cannot be explained away and cannot be dismissed. A deep and unaccountable peace in the middle of terrible suffering, a genuine forgiveness that defies every natural human instinct for revenge, an integrity that visibly costs the person dearly and that they nevertheless maintain without wavering, a love that keeps showing up and keeps giving, faithfully, long after any ordinary love would have run dry and quit. Then something gets through, something slips past all the careful defenses. They are confronted suddenly, not with a claim to be debated and refuted, but with a reality that must somehow be reckoned with and accounted for. And many a hardened skeptic has been undone in the end, not by a clever argument they could not answer, but by a life they could not explain. The Apostle Peter wrote to believers who were scattered across a genuinely hostile and often violent world, and he told them something remarkable, that their conduct, their obedient and faithful way of living, could actually win people who would never in 1,000 years be won by mere words. That some would be persuaded, as he put it, even without the word, simply by observing over time the obedient and beautiful lives of the believers who lived quietly among them. The obedience itself was the sermon. The faithfulness itself was the argument. The visible way that these ordinary people lived, especially under real pressure and real cost, preached a gospel that mere speech alone could never have delivered to those particular hearts. And this remains every bit as true in every generation, right down to our own. There are people in your own life right now, this week, who will never once be reached by anything at all that you say to them about God, but who are watching closely, whether you realize it or not, exactly how you live. And your obedience, especially your obedience precisely when it visibly costs you something, is speaking to them constantly in a language that quietly bypasses all of their defenses and goes straight to the heart. This should both sober us and dignify us deeply, and at the very same time. It should sober us because it means, unavoidably, that our disobedience also preaches. That when those who publicly claim the name of Christ live in a way that is utterly indistinguishable from everyone else around them, or worse, they preach a loud and eloquent sermon of emptiness that hardens hearts against the gospel and hands the watching skeptic exactly the evidence he was hoping to find all along. But it should also dignify our obedience, even the most hidden and costly and unnoticed kind, beyond measure, because it means that no faithful choice you ever make is truly wasted or truly unseen, that someone, somewhere, is always watching, and that your quiet obedience in a hard and unwitnessed season may turn out to be the single most persuasive and unanswerable sermon that a watching, skeptical soul ever encounters in their whole life. So live as though your life were a testimony, because it is, whether you intend it to be or not. Obey as though someone were always watching, because someone always is, not to perform, not for show, not to be seen and admired by men. For the obedience that truly preaches is precisely the obedience that is most real, the kind that would be offered up faithfully even if no human eye were watching at all. But with a quiet, Humble awareness that God has a way of taking our simple faithfulness and using it to reach people we could never ever reach with our words alone. Your obedient life is a sermon being preached every single day to everyone who knows you and watches you. So, by His grace, make it a sermon worth hearing. Let the very way that you live become, over the years, an argument for the goodness of the God you have chosen to obey. Lesson 24. Obedience deepens with time and never ends. Obedience is not a destination that you finally arrive at one day and then are done with. It is a road that you walk for the entire length of your life, right to the very end. And one of the truly beautiful and deeply humbling truths of the whole spiritual life is that it never ends, never graduates, never once reaches some final point at which you have completely finished learning to obey and may now rest on your laurels. The most mature and seasoned believer who has ever lived was still on the very last day of their long life, learning obedience in some fresh new dimension, still being invited deeper, still discovering areas and corners of their own heart that had not yet been fully surrendered to God. And this is not, as it might first sound, a discouraging thing at all. Rightly understood, it is in fact one of the very most hopeful things about the entire journey of faith. We tend, most of us, to imagine spiritual maturity as a kind of arrival, a high plateau of finally achieved holiness, where the long struggle is at last over and done with, where obedience has become effortless and automatic, where we have essentially made it and can coast. But this is simply not the picture that the Scripture ever paints for us, and it is not the honest testimony of those who have actually walked the furthest down the road. Quite the opposite. The deeper a person goes with God, the more clearly they come to see just how much further there still is to go. The closer they draw toward the pure light of His presence, the more clearly they begin to see the areas of their own life that still lie in shadow, that had been invisible to them in the dimness further back. Obedience is not a single mountain that you climb once, plant your flag on the summit and then stand atop forever finished. It is an endless and glorious ascent up into an infinite God, and every level of surrender that you reach reveals, above it, a deeper level still yet to be given. The saints who have drawn nearest to God have always, without fail, been the ones most keenly aware of just how much of themselves still remained to be surrendered, not because they had somehow failed or fallen behind, but precisely because their very nearness to the light showed them plainly what those standing further back in the dimness simply could not yet see. And this means something wonderfully freeing for you, that wherever you happen to be right now in your own personal journey of obedience, there is always more ahead. And this is very good news, not bad news, however it may sound at first. If you are only just beginning, right at the start of the road, then take real heart. You are not expected to have already arrived, and the same God who first called you out onto the road will walk faithfully beside you through an entire lifetime of gradual, patient deepening. There is no rush, and there is no shame in being a beginner. And if you have already walked with God for long decades, then take heart just as fully. The road has not run out beneath you. The great adventure of surrender is not over, and there are still depths of intimacy and freedom and joy waiting for you in acts of obedience that you have not yet even been asked for. No one is ever too new to begin the journey, and no one is ever too advanced or too seasoned to keep growing on it. The invitation to go deeper is always open, at every single stage, from the first day to the very last. And there is a particular and unexpected sweetness in an obedience that deepens across time. The obedience of the raw beginner is very often anxious, effortful, uncertain, full of second-guessing and strain. But the obedience of the seasoned saint has, over the years, taken on a completely different quality and texture. It has become, through long and faithful practice, more like breathing than like fighting, more natural, more settled, more quietly joyful, far less a desperate battle and far more a peaceful and habitual way of simply being. What began long ago as a hard struggle against the stubborn self has become, through years of repetition and grace, an increasingly effortless flowing along with the goodwill of God. The yes that once cost so very much and had to be wrenched out at great price comes more and more easily and gladly. The trust that once trembled and shook has grown over time, sturdy and strong and unshakable. And though there are always, to the very end, new and deeper obediences that stretch even the most mature among us, the overall direction and trajectory of the whole long journey is unmistakably toward an ever greater peace and an ever greater freedom and an ever greater joy in the obeying, a peace and freedom and joy that the anxious beginner back at the start could scarcely have imagined possible. So do not be discouraged and do not despair. That obedience never fully ends this side of heaven. Instead, learn to rejoice in it, because what it truly means is that the relationship itself never stops deepening. The intimacy never stops growing richer. The adventure never runs dry or comes to a dull and final stop. You are on a road that leads ever upward and ever inward, further and further into the very heart of an infinite and inexhaustible God. And every single step of obedience that you take carries you further in and further up into more of Him than you had the day before. The road is long precisely because the God waiting at the end of it is infinite and without limit. And every single day that you walk it faithfully, in obedience, you go a little deeper into a love that has no bottom to it, and a joy that has no end. Lesson 25. Obedience is how you store up treasure that lasts. We spend the whole of our lives, most of us, frantically accumulating things that we cannot possibly keep. This is the quiet, unspoken tragedy running like a dark thread underneath so very much of all our human striving. The ceaseless, driven gathering of wealth and status and comfort and reputation and possessions, every last bit of which will be stripped away from us at the end, without a single exception, none of which we will be able to carry with us through the narrow door of death. And Jesus, who saw this universal human tragedy with a clarity so perfect it must have grieved Him, offered us instead a radical and completely different alternative. A whole way of living in which we store up for ourselves a treasure that death itself cannot touch or reach or diminish. And that way, that method, that means of laying up imperishable treasure is obedience. Lay not up for yourselves treasures upon earth, He taught the crowds on the mountainside, where moth and rust doth corrupt, and where thieves break through and steal. But lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven. And the question that this beautiful command immediately and naturally raises in any thoughtful heart is simply, how? How does a person actually go about storing up treasure in heaven? Is it some vague, mystical, unreachable process? No. It is not abstract or mysterious at all. It happens concretely and practically through obedience, through the countless daily choices to do what God says, to invest our lives in what He values rather than in what the world values, to spend our short years and our limited resources on the things that will outlast this whole passing world rather than on the things that will very shortly burn up and blow away. Every single act of obedience is a real deposit made into an account that no thief on earth can ever reach, that no moth and no rust and no decay can ever touch or corrupt, that no death can ever empty or steal. The obedient life is, quite literally, the only genuinely wise investment strategy in the entire universe, because it is the only one whose returns actually survive the grave and go on paying dividends forever. Consider for a moment the strange and wonderful economics of it, so different from the economics of the world. The person who obeys God in the matter of open-handed generosity gives away money that they could never have kept in the end anyway, and receives in exchange for it a treasure that they can and will keep forever. The person who obeys God in humbly serving others spends time that was simply going to pass by and be gone regardless. and converts that vanishing time into something solid and eternal that endures. The person who obeys God in love, in forgiveness, in faithfulness, in patience, is taking the perishable, quickly spoiling currency of this brief and fleeting life and exchanging it, through their obedience, for the imperishable and incorruptible currency of the world that is to come. This is not, whatever it may feel like in the moment of sacrifice, a losing trade. It is the single greatest and wisest trade available to any human being anywhere. The trade of giving up what you cannot possibly keep in order to gain what you can never possibly lose. And obedience is the very mechanism, the exchange itself, by which that wonderful trade is actually made, day by day and choice by choice. There is a great clarifying power in remembering this, especially in exactly those moments when obedience is genuinely costly and the sacrifice it asks of you feels, right then, like nothing but pure and painful loss. When you obey God at real and heavy expense to yourself, when faithfulness costs you actual money or comfort or advancement or ease or opportunity, it can feel in that very moment as though you are simply losing something precious, watching it slip through your fingers for nothing. But from the true and clear perspective of eternity, you are not losing anything at all. You are transferring it. You are simply moving your treasure from the one account that will most certainly be emptied and lost at death, over into the other account that will be full and safe and yours forever. What looks and feels in the moment like sheer sacrifice is in reality the wisest and shrewdest possible investment. What looks like loss is actually the only real and lasting gain there is. The obedient are not, as they may sometimes appear to be, the ones who are always giving things up and going without. They are, in truth, the ones who are quietly sending their treasure on ahead of them, to a place where it will be waiting. So when the real cost of obedience tempts you to hold back, to protect yourself, to keep what you have, lift your eyes and remember what it is you are actually doing in that moment. You are laying up treasure in the one place where it will genuinely last forever. You are investing your one brief and unrepeatable life in the only economy in all the universe that does not, in the end, collapse into nothing. Every costly obedience is a real deposit made directly into eternity, and no such deposit is ever lost or forgotten or wasted. The moth cannot reach it there. The rust cannot corrupt it. The thief cannot break through and steal it. And on that final day, when absolutely everything else has been stripped away and left behind, the treasure that you stored up quietly through a whole long lifetime of faithful obedience will be waiting there for you, undiminished, uncorrupted, and overflowing in the very presence of the God you were obeying and loving all along. Lesson 26. Obedience requires community to sustain it. We were never once meant to obey God all alone, in isolation, and the attempt to do so, to walk this whole road as a solitary spiritual hero, is one of the most common reasons that obedience over time falters and finally fails in a life. The Christian life was designed, from the very beginning, by God Himself, to be lived out in community, in the close company of others who are walking the very same road alongside us. And obedience in particular is sustained and strengthened and safeguarded and protected by the fellowship of other believers in a way that the solitary struggler almost always drastically underestimates, right up until the day it is too late and they have already fallen. Consider carefully how obedience actually fails in a real human life, because it is rarely how we imagine. It very rarely collapses all at once, in a single dramatic moment of catastrophic decision. Far more often it erodes, quietly, gradually, invisibly, in isolation, in the dark, in precisely the hidden areas of life that we keep carefully sealed off and concealed from everyone else. The temptation that would have almost no power over us at all, if only it were spoken aloud honestly to a single trusted friend, gains enormous and secret power precisely because it is kept hidden and unspoken. The slow drift away from obedience that would have been caught early and easily by people who knew us well and loved us enough to notice is instead allowed to continue on, unchecked and unopposed, for months or years, because we have quietly hidden ourselves away from anyone who might have noticed the drift and lovingly said so. Sin is, by its very nature, a creature of darkness and of isolation. It thrives and grows fat and gains its strength in the unlit, unshared, sealed-off corners of a life. And community is light. To bring our hidden struggles honestly out into the company of trusted others is to drag those struggles into a light in which they immediately begin to lose much of their dark power over us. The Scripture understood this danger with a penetrating and practical wisdom that we badly need to recover. Exhort one another daily, it urges us plainly, while it is called today, lest any of you be hardened through the deceitfulness of sin. Daily. One another. Notice both of those words. The hardening of heart that leads step by step to full disobedience is described here as a deceitful process, one that works by slow, small degrees, so gradually and so subtly that the very person being hardened cannot see it happening to themselves. That is the whole danger of it. The deceit is specifically designed to slip right past our own self-awareness so that we are the last to know. And the God-given remedy for this is not, notice, more solitary willpower and more private resolve. The very things the deceit is engineered to defeat, the remedy is the daily voice of others, the mutual exhortation of a real community, the trusted friends who can see clearly what we cannot see about ourselves and who love us enough to actually say it out loud, even when it is hard to hear. We are protected from the slow, subtle, creeping deceit of sin, not primarily by our own vigilance, which the deceit is expressly designed to slip past unnoticed, but by the loving eyes of others who can see the drift that we ourselves have gone blind to. This is precisely why the person who tries to obey God while carefully avoiding all real, deep, honest Christian community is fighting the battle with one hand tied firmly behind their back, and very predictably, usually losing it. They have cut themselves off by their own choice from the very thing that God specifically designed to sustain their obedience through the long haul. They have no one to confess to honestly, and so their secrets fester and grow in the dark. They have no one to be truly accountable to, and so their gradual drift goes on entirely unchecked. They have no one to encourage them and hold them up when obedience grows hard and heavy. No one to remind them of what is actually true when the old lie grows loud and persuasive. No one to carry them for a while when their own strength finally gives out, as everyone's strength eventually does. The isolated believer is, always and inevitably, the vulnerable believer. And the enemy of their soul knows this perfectly well and works tirelessly and patiently to keep them isolated and alone, because alone is exactly where obedience is easiest to wear down and defeat. So if you have been trying to walk this whole road entirely by yourself, privately, secretly, heroically, and alone, then please hear this next part as an urgent and loving invitation, not a rebuke. Find your people. Not merely a crowd, not merely a large congregation that you sit within anonymously once a week, known by no one, but a few real others. A handful is enough, who genuinely know you, to whom you can actually tell the truth about your life, who will exhort you daily and catch you when you begin to drift and carry you when you find that you cannot walk on your own. Obedience, it turns out, is a team sport. It was never meant to be a solitary act of heroism performed alone in the dark. The saints who actually endured to the very end almost never ever endured alone. They were held up again and again and again over the years by the strong hands of others who happened to be walking the very same road beside them. So go and find those hands, and then, in turn, become those very hands for someone else who needs them. Obedience is sustained in community, and community is a gift that God gives us precisely and lovingly because He knows better than we do that we simply cannot do this alone. Lesson 27. Obedience confronts and heals. Your deepest fears, underneath most of our disobedience, as we have already touched on together earlier in this journey, there lies fear. But here I want to go deeper into that truth than we have gone before, because obedience does not merely require us to push past our fears once, gritting our teeth. Practiced faithfully over time, obedience actually heals our fears, reaching all the way down to the very root of what we are most deeply afraid of. And, through the repeated lived experience of God's faithfulness in exactly that place, slowly drawing the poison out. Obedience is not only the overcoming of fear in the moment, it is, in the long run, its very cure. Every deep fear that a human being carries is, at bottom, underneath everything else, a belief about God, a quiet, often unexamined, theological conviction. The fear of the future is, at its root, a belief that God cannot really be trusted with what is coming toward us. The fear of lack, of not having enough, is a belief that God will not, in the end, actually provide for us. The fear of loss is a belief that God's goodness does not truly extend all the way into the dark places that we most dread walking through. Our fears are theological, before they are ever merely emotional. They are, underneath all their surface trembling, quiet convictions that in some particular and specific area of life, God is not really good or not really present or not really enough for us. And this is precisely exactly why obedience heals fear so powerfully, because obedience takes those quiet, hidden convictions and puts them directly to the test out in the open, and then lets God Himself disprove them, one obedient step at a time. Here is how the healing actually works in real life. When you obey God in the exact area of your deepest and most specific fear, when you give generously in spite of your gnawing fear of lack, when you step forward in spite of your paralyzing fear of failure, when you release your desperate grip on control in spite of your fear of what will surely happen if you do, you create, by that very act, the precise conditions in which God is able to meet you there and prove your fear wrong. You obey directly into the heart of the fear, and then you discover, on the far side of it, that the God you were so afraid to trust was in fact completely trustworthy all along. And that discovery does something for you that the mere white-knuckled suppression of fear could never do, not in 100 years. It reaches down and heals the false belief that was lying underneath the fear all along, generating it. It does not merely help you push past the frightening emotion this one time, only for it to return unchanged tomorrow. It reaches down to the root and revises the false conviction about God's character that was quietly manufacturing the fear in the first place. This is exactly why the areas of our very deepest fear are so often in the providence of God, the precise areas in which He asks for our obedience. He is not being cruel in this, asking us to do the very thing we most dread. He is offering us healing. He is lovingly inviting us to bring our single, most fearful place into direct, living contact with His proven faithfulness, so that the fear can finally be answered by the only thing in all the universe that can actually answer it, which is the lived, first-hand, undeniable experience of His trustworthiness in the very place we were most terrified to trust Him. Every fear that is obeyed through is a fear that has been given the real chance to be healed at last. And a whole lifetime of obeying into our fears, again and again, produces over the years a person who is progressively and genuinely liberated from the very terrors that once ruled and dominated them, not by pretending the fears away or by suppressing them, but by watching God prove faithful over and over in each and every one of them, until the fear simply has no ground left to stand on anymore. So consider honestly what it is that you are most deeply afraid of, and then consider the real possibility that this very fear may be marking the exact place where God most wants to meet you and heal you. The one obedience that you are most strongly resisting right now, the one that touches directly on your deepest fear, may in fact be the doorway to the very deepest healing that is available to you in this whole season of your life. So do not run away from the fearful obedience as everything in you wants to. Walk into it slowly, holding tightly to God's hand, and let Him prove to you right there in your most frightened and defended place that He is exactly as good and exactly as faithful as He has always claimed to be. That is how fear finally dies. Not by being carefully avoided forever, but by being walked straight through in the company of a faithful God, until the very thing you always dreaded becomes instead the solid ground on which you learned, at long last, that He could be trusted all along. Lesson 28. Obedience shapes you into the image of Christ. The ultimate purpose of your entire life, according to the clear witness of the Scripture, is not merely to be forgiven, as glorious and necessary as forgiveness is. It is not merely to be comfortable or safe or successful. It is not even merely to be happy, though God delights in your joy. The ultimate purpose of your life is to be transformed, to be remade thoroughly from the inside out into the very likeness of Jesus Christ Himself. This is the great destination toward which God is steadily, patiently, and lovingly moving every single life that has been surrendered to Him. And obedience is the primary means, the main road, by which that astonishing transformation actually happens in us. We become like Christ, not mainly by thinking correct thoughts about Him, or by feeling warm feelings toward Him, but by obeying as He obeyed, until, slowly, over years, His own character is quietly formed within us through the faithful practice of His ways. There is a deep principle woven right into the very fabric of all creation, and it is this: we become what we repeatedly do. The actions that we practice over and over gradually shape the very people that we become, carving grooves into our character that grow deeper and more permanent with every single repetition, until what began as a deliberate and effortful choice becomes, in time, an ingrained habit, and finally, at last, a settled and second nature. This principle is true of absolutely everything, for good and for ill alike. The practiced cruelty that slowly hardens a soul into a genuinely cruel character, and the practiced kindness that slowly softens a soul into a genuinely kind one. And this very same principle is precisely the engine of Christ-likeness in a believer. Every single time you obey God in a concrete act of love, you become, by a tiny and imperceptible degree, a slightly more loving person than you were before. Every single time you obey Him in an act of forgiveness, forgiveness itself becomes a little more natural, a little more instinctive to you. Every obedience, however small, repeated faithfully over time, is quietly and steadily reshaping your very nature into the likeness of the one you are obeying. This is exactly why obedience matters so very much more than we usually tend to think it does, and why it can never be reduced down to the mere cold following of external rules. Each individual act of obedience is not simply a discrete good deed, checked off a list, done, and then forgotten. It is far more than that. It is a single chisel stroke on the great statue that God is patiently carving out of the raw stone of your life. It is one more step in the lifelong process by which an ordinary human soul is being remade, slowly, into the very image of Christ. When you obey, You are not only doing a good thing in that moment, you are becoming a certain kind of person, the very kind of person that the obedience itself is training and shaping you to be. And over the long course of a whole lifetime of such obediences, the cumulative effect of them is absolutely staggering to behold. A whole character reshaped from the ground up, a whole nature transformed, a person who has slowly become, through 10,000 quiet acts of obedience, genuinely and increasingly and unmistakably like Jesus himself. And this transformation is, in the very end, the deepest answer of all to the question of why obedience is even worth it. Because the person that God is patiently making you into, through all of these obediences, great and small, is the very person that you yourself most deeply and truly want to be. Even in the moments when you are actively resisting the specific obedience that is making you that way. The love and the peace and the freedom and the strength and the deep joy that you see so clearly in Christ and long for so achingly in yourself, these precious things are not and cannot be simply given to you all at once as a lump sum, downloaded into you in a single instant of decision. They are grown patiently through the long practice of obedience into a settled character that comes in time to actually possess them. You want, more than you can say, to be like him. And obedience is precisely how, day by ordinary day and choice by ordinary choice, you are actually and truly becoming so. So see your obedience now for what it truly and finally is. It is not a heavy burden imposed on you from the outside by a demanding God. It is the very process itself by which you are being transformed into the person you were created from before the foundation of the world to be. Every single yes to God is one more step in your becoming. Every act of obedience is the very Spirit of God, using your surrendered and willing will to carve you a little more fully and a little more beautifully into the image of Christ. And on that final day, when you at last see him as he truly is, face to face, and are made in an instant fully and completely like him, you will look back over every costly obedience of this whole earthly life and understand, with a flood of wonder and gratitude, that each and every one of them was a single stroke of the loving chisel that was shaping you all along into glory. Obedience is not merely something that you do. It is, in the deepest sense, who you are becoming. Lesson 29. Obedience prepares you for eternity. Everything in this present life is, in some real sense, a preparation for what comes after it. This is a perspective that has been almost entirely lost in a culture that lives and teaches us all to live, as though this brief and visible world were quite simply all that there is and all that there ever will be. And recovering this lost perspective changes the meaning of absolutely everything. And it changes the meaning of obedience most of all. The obedience that you practice now, today, in the small and ordinary circumstances of your present life, is not merely getting you through the challenges of the present moment. It is actively forming in you the very capacities and character that you will go on to exercise forever. It is training you quietly for a life that lies beyond this one, a life that the obedient are, even now, being carefully and lovingly prepared to live. The Scripture speaks, in various places and in language that strains at the edges of what we can comprehend, of the faithful being entrusted in the life to come, with responsibilities and joys that lie beyond anything they ever knew or imagined here, of the servant who was faithful over just a few small things being made ruler and steward over many great things, of the obedient reigning together with Christ himself, of rewards and roles and responsibilities in eternity that correspond in some real but mysterious way that we cannot yet fully grasp to the quality of the faithfulness that was quietly practiced during this short and testing life. Now, we do not understand all of exactly what this means, and we ought to be genuinely humble about the specific details, refusing to speculate beyond what is written, but the broad and general shape of it is absolutely unmistakable throughout the scripture. This present life is not a self-contained little episode that simply ends and is over, but rather a training ground, a proving season, a school, a time in which the very character and the very capacity required for a vast eternity are being shaped and formed and tested within us. And obedience is the curriculum of that school. The one who learns here and now in this life to be faithful, to be trustworthy, to love and to serve, and to gladly submit their own will to the good will of God, that person is being genuinely and carefully prepared for a scope and a fullness of life in eternity that the disobedient, who never once developed any of these capacities, will simply not be ready or able to step into. This truth reframes completely the true significance of even the very smallest present obedience. When you obey God today, quietly, in some small and entirely unseen matter that no one else will ever know about, you are not merely performing an isolated good deed that will be noticed by no one and soon forgotten by all. You are, in that very moment, actively participating in a great training program whose diploma is granted not here, but in eternity, developing right now a faithfulness that will one day fit you and equip you for responsibilities and joys far beyond this present world. Nothing is wasted, nothing at all. Every single obedience is building a real and lasting capacity within you that carries over, unbroken, into the next life, forming a character that death does not erase or destroy, but rather releases at last into its full and unhindered expression. The very person that you are steadily becoming right now, through all your present obedience, is the very same person who will one day step across the threshold into eternity. And the obediences of this short life are, even now, quietly shaping the scope and the substance and the joy of the life you will go on to live forever. There is enormous dignity in this truth, and there is enormous encouragement in it, and it is offered especially, tenderly, to those whose obedience takes place almost entirely in obscurity, unseen, unthanked, and unrewarded by anyone at all in this present life. The faithful mother whose patient, obedient, daily love no one ever stands up to applaud. The quiet, ordinary believer whose costly integrity earns them not one shred of earthly recognition or reward. The hidden servant of God whose years of faithfulness go entirely unnoticed and uncelebrated by the watching world. Hear this, all of you, none of it is lost, none of it, and none of it is in vain. It is all being recorded carefully by the one who sees in secret. It is all being formed even now into eternal character. It is all being quietly prepared for a coming day when the hidden faithful will at last be revealed and honored, when the last shall be first, and when the small and obscure and unnoticed obediences of an entire lifetime will be shown, to the wonder of all, to have been building something magnificent and glorious and eternal the whole time, all along, in the dark. So lift your eyes now, up and beyond the narrow horizon of this present life, and let the sheer vastness of the eternity that is coming give real weight and real meaning and real dignity to the obediences of today, however small and unseen they seem. You are not merely getting through your days one after another until they run out. You are being prepared through every single act of obedience, great and small, for a life that does not end. You are being formed into the kind of person who will one day be able to bear the immense and joyful weight of glory. You are being trained, even now, for a scope of joyful responsibility and delight in the very presence of God that this present life can only faintly hint at and foreshadow. Obedience is the preparation. Eternity is the destination. And every faithful yes that you offer now, today, in obscurity and in cost, is getting you ready for a life so full and so glorious and so overflowing with joy that the very hardest obedience of this present world will seem, in the blazing light of it, to have been only a small and momentary thing, a light and momentary affliction that was working for you all along, an eternal weight of glory far beyond all comparison. Lesson 30. Obedience is ultimately a love story. We come, at last, to the 30th and final lesson, the one that holds all of the other 29 together and gives them their meaning. The one lesson without which every single one of the others would collapse, in the end, into mere cold religion. And it is simply this: obedience to God is not, at its deepest heart, about rules or about duty or about performance or about fear. It is about love. It is the free response of a beloved to the one who first loved them. Everything that we have said together across all of these long hours and all of these 29 lessons finds its final and truest meaning right here in this last one, in the simple, staggering, world-remaking truth that the entire story of obedience is, from beginning to end, a love story. It is the story of God's love for you and of your love, awakened and kindled by His, flowing back to Him in the form of a whole life that has learned at last to say yes. Strip away this one center, remove this beating heart, and obedience instantly becomes a cold and crushing and joyless thing, a set of harsh demands issued by a distant and unsmiling authority, a desperate performance to somehow earn an approval that never quite feels secure, an anxious, endless striving to avoid a punishment we are always dreading. This is the obedience of the terrified slave, and it is not, hear this, it is not what God is after at all. It never was. He is not looking for slaves who obey Him out of raw terror. He is not building for Himself a kingdom populated by frightened, cringing servants, forever performing for a master they do not love and secretly resent. From the very beginning, from the garden all the way to the cross, all the way to the end of all things, God has been patiently and relentlessly pursuing something infinitely more beautiful and infinitely more costly than mere compliance. A people who obey Him because they genuinely love Him, and who love Him because they have finally, at long last, understood how completely and how unstoppably and how sacrificially He first loved them. We love Him, the Apostle John wrote, in words that quietly unlock the whole vast mystery, because He first loved us. That is the order of it. That is the engine that drives everything. The love always comes first, His love for us poured out before we ever turned toward Him, and our obedience is, in the end, simply love answering love. This is precisely why the very deepest and truest obedience can never, ever be produced by pressure or by guilt or by fear or by force. Those things can produce compliance, yes, for a while under the right conditions, but they can never produce the glad, wholehearted, freely given, joyful obedience that God actually desires and delights in. Because that kind of obedience can only ever grow up out of love, and love by its very nature cannot be coerced or forced or extracted. It can only be awakened, and it is awakened above all else by one single thing: by seeing, really seeing at last, and all the way down, just how much we ourselves are loved. When a human heart finally and truly grasps the love of God, the love that formed us in the first place, the love that patiently pursued us through all our running, the love that came all the way down for us in Jesus, the love that went all the way to a bloody cross for us, the love that has never once, not for a single instant, stopped reaching out toward us, even in the very depths of our worst rebellion. Then, in that moment, obedience stops being a burden to be endured and becomes instead a longing to be fulfilled. You begin, almost without noticing it, to actually want to obey, Not because you are afraid of what will happen to you if you do not, but because you love the one who is asking, and love delights, always, to please the beloved. And this transforms the whole of everything we have walked through together. Obedience as trust becomes trust, placed in someone who has already proven his love for us, beyond all possible doubt, on a cross. Obedience as worship becomes the glad and grateful response of a heart utterly overwhelmed by grace it never earned. Obedience as the dethroning of the self becomes the joyful, relieved abdication of a throne we were exhausted to sit on anyway, handing it gladly over to one who loves us more than we have ever managed to love ourselves. Every hard lesson softens. Every heavy command grows suddenly light. Every difficult surrender becomes possible the very moment it is finally understood as love answering love. The exact same act that is utterly crushing when it is done for a cold and distant tyrant becomes a pure joy when it is done instead for a beloved. And God is not a tyrant. He never was. He is the beloved who loved you first, and whose every command is, underneath, the invitation of that love, and whose whole and entire desire toward you is not to break you or to use you, but only, ever, to bring you home to himself. So let this be the one truth that holds all the others together and frames them. If you take away nothing else from these 30 lessons and all these hours we have spent together, let the 30th be the golden frame around all the rest of them. You are loved. You were loved before you ever obeyed a single command. You were loved at your most rebellious and your most far off. You were pursued at your most distant, and wanted at your most unworthy, and welcomed at your most ashamed. And every single call to obedience in all of Scripture, from the very first page to the very last, is, underneath everything else it may seem to be, the tender voice of that same love, inviting you closer, calling you home, asking you for the only thing that love has ever really wanted from anyone, which is simply the free and willing response of another heart, freely turning back toward the one who never ever stopped loving it. So obey then, not as a frightened slave obeys a master, but as the deeply beloved child that you truly are. Let your whole life, from this day on, become love's own answer to love. That is what obedience was always, from the very beginning, meant to be. And that is exactly what it becomes at last, the moment you finally understand whose voice it is that has been calling you all along, and how completely and how patiently and how long and how well you have been loved. And so we have walked together all the way through all 30. 30 doors, 30 windows, 30 different angles on a single word that we began hours ago now quietly dreading, and that I pray with all my heart you can now hold in your open hands without flinching, and perhaps, just perhaps, even begin to love. Obedience is not the cage we always feared it was. It never was. It is the very pathway into everything that we most deeply and achingly long for: trust made real and solid, intimacy with the living God, a freedom that actually lasts, a self set free at last from its own exhausting tyranny, a life aligned with the deep grain of reality, a character being remade slowly into the image of Christ, a treasure that not even death can touch or steal, and, above and beneath and through all of it, a love story in which we are, astonishingly, undeservedly, gloriously, the beloved. 30 lessons. One great and life-changing yes, and a whole lifetime, and then a whole eternity beyond it, in which to keep discovering what that single yes sets quietly in motion. Before we close, I want to speak very directly and very gently to the one particular person who most needs to hear this final word, and you already know in your heart, if it is you. You have been holding something back from God. There is an area, and you know exactly precisely which one it is even now, where you have not yet said your yes. You have obeyed him, perhaps, in 100 other things, faithfully and gladly. But this one thing you have kept back for yourself, guarded, walled off, unsurrendered, because it frightens you, or because you want it too much to let it go, or because you are not yet quite sure that you can really trust him with it. And this whole teaching, all 30 lessons of it, has really, in the end, been about that one thing, about the yes you have not yet said. So let me tell you gently, as a friend, the very obedience you are most afraid of is the doorway to the very freedom you most deeply want. On the other side of that one surrender is not the loss you fear, but life. More life than you can imagine. He is not asking for it in order to take something precious from you. He is asking for it in order to give you himself, so do not be afraid. The one who is asking loved you enough to die for you. You can trust him, you truly can, with the very thing you have been holding back. Lay it down, say the yes, and discover, as so many countless others have discovered before you, that the hardest obedience becomes, in the end, the doorway into the deepest and most lasting joy you have ever known. If this teaching has met you somewhere real today, if even one of these 30 lessons landed in a place that genuinely needed it, then let me ask you to do just one thing before you go. And it is the thing that matters most of all. Send this to one person. There is someone in your life right now whose face came quietly to your mind at some point while you were listening. Someone who is carrying the exact weight that this teaching spoke to. Someone standing right at the edge of a surrender they are afraid to make. Someone who desperately needs to hear that obedience is not a cage at all, but a doorway home. Send it to them. It costs you nothing, and it may become, in their hardest and darkest week, the very word that carries them through to the other side. That single, simple act of sharing is a quiet gift of love toward one soul, and it may reach further into the depths of their life than you will ever know this side of heaven. And then, if this channel has become a place that you want to return to, a steady room you want to come back to, then subscribe as well, so that the next teaching finds you when it comes. It is completely free, and it is only a single tap, and it simply keeps your seat here among all of us who are walking this same long road home together. Then, before you go, would you leave one last comment and tell me, which of these 30 lessons did you most need to hear today? Name it honestly in the comments below, so that someone else scrolling quietly past in their own hard hour might be strengthened by the very same truth that strengthened you. And now, receive this blessing, spoken directly and personally over you, wherever in the world you are and whatever you are carrying. May the God who loved you first give you the courage this week to finally say the one yes you have been withholding from him. May he meet you powerfully and tenderly in the very place you are most afraid to obey, and prove himself faithful there beyond all your fears. May your obedience become, from this day forward, not a heavy burden that you carry, but a love that you gladly offer, freely, joyfully, as the true beloved that you actually are. May you discover, in every single act of surrender, that his commands were always all along invitations, and that his yoke was always kind, and that his whole desire toward you, from before the world began, was only ever to bring you safely home. And may the deep peace of the very one you are learning to obey, the peace that passes all human understanding, guard your heart and guard your mind today and tomorrow and all the way into the eternity that you are, even now, being lovingly prepared for. You are loved. You always were loved. You always will be. Now go and let your whole life become love's own answer to love. Go in peace.